Some mornings, the sea gives nothing back. Jonesport sits at the eastern edge of Maine, a fishing village of roughly 1,300 people spread across a series of rocky peninsulas and tidal islands. The town clings to the edge of the continent, like something that refuses to let go. To the south lies the open Atlantic. To the east, the Bay of Fundy churns with some of the most extreme tides on Earth, water levels that rise and fall by more than 20 feet twice a day, reshaping the coastline every 12 hours. The people here have fished these waters for generations. Lobstering is not a profession in Jonesport. It is an inheritance. Families pass down mooring rights, trap locations, and knowledge of the currents the way other families pass down farmland or business shares. Children learn to read fog patterns before they learn to read books. By the time most Jonesport natives reach adulthood, they have already survived at least one close call, a rogue wave, a tangled line, an engine failure miles from shore. The ocean here is not romantic. It is transactional. You give it respect. Sometimes it gives you a living. Other times it takes without asking. Jonesport Harbor is small, protected by a natural breakwater formed by Beals Island to the south. Most mornings the harbor fills with the low rumble of diesel engines as lobster boats head out before dawn. By mid-morning the docks grow quiet. The village waits. August of 1987 was unseasonably calm. The summer had been dry, the waters unusually clear. Fishermen reported good hauls and easy conditions, the kind of season old-timers later describe as too easy, the kind that makes you wonder what you missed. On the morning of August 11, 1987, the Darlene Marie departed Jonesport Harbor at approximately 4:45 a.m. Aboard were 3 men, Captain Earl Hodgkins, age 54, his brother-in-law, Dale Beal, age 48, and deckhand Thomas Falkingham, age 29. All 3 were lifelong residents of the area. Combined, they had more than 70 years of experience on these waters. The weather report that morning called for clear skies, light winds from the southwest, and unlimited visibility. The sea state was listed as calm. There was no fog advisory, no storm system approaching, nothing in the forecast to suggest concern. The Darlene Marie was a 36-foot wooden lobster boat, well-maintained, recently inspected, and equipped with a VHF radio, compass, and basic navigation instruments. Earl Hodgkins had captained her for 19 years without serious incident. At approximately 6:15 a.m., Earl radioed the harbor master's office with a routine position check. He reported being roughly 4 miles southeast of Mistake Island, heading toward a string of traps near the outer ledges. His tone was calm. Visibility, he noted, was still excellent. At 6:52 a.m., a second transmission came through. This one was different. Earl's voice was steady but slower, as if he were choosing his words carefully. He reported that a fog bank had come out of nowhere and was now surrounding the vessel. He described it as thick and low, sitting on the water like it had weight. He said the compass had begun spinning, first slowly, then erratically. He asked if any other boats were reporting similar conditions. The harbor master, Calvin Alley, replied that no other vessels had mentioned fog. He asked Earl to confirm his position. There was a pause. Then Earl said, "We're not sure anymore." That was the last transmission from the Darlene Marie. Calvin Alley would later tell investigators that he tried to raise the boat 6 more times over the next hour. Each attempt was met with silence. He described the silence as heavy, though he could not explain what he meant by that. Other fishermen in the area were contacted. None had seen the Darlene Marie. None had encountered fog. By noon, the Coast Guard had launched a search. Conditions remained clear throughout the day. Aircraft covered a grid pattern extending 20 miles in every direction from the boat's last known position. No fog was observed anywhere in the region. The Darlene Marie was found 2 days later, on August 13th. drifting approximately 11 miles east of its original course, well outside the normal fishing grounds. A Coast Guard cutter spotted it just after sunrise, sitting motionless on flat water. The boat was intact. The engine was still running, idling in neutral. The fuel tank was nearly full. In the small cabin below deck, a pot of coffee sat on the stove, still warm to the touch. 3 coffee mugs were set out on the chart table, as if someone had been about to pour. All 3 life jackets were still stowed in their compartment. The emergency beacon had not been activated. The radio was functional but turned off. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of illness, accident, or foul play. The 3 men were simply gone. Roberta Hodgkins, Earl's wife of 31 years, was among the first to arrive at the dock when the Darlene Marie was towed back to Jonesport. She later described the scene to a reporter from the Bangor Daily News. "The boat looked fine," she said. "That's what I can't get out of my head. It looked like they'd just stepped off for a minute, like they'd be right back." She paused, then added, "But they're not coming back. I knew it the second I saw those mugs. Earl would never leave coffee sitting like that. Never." Harbor Master Calvin Alley refused most interview requests in the years that followed, but he did speak once to a researcher from the Maine Maritime Academy who was compiling a study on unexplained maritime incidents. "I've been on these waters my whole life," Alley said. "I've seen fog roll in fast. I've seen compasses act up near certain ledges, but I've never heard a man sound the way Earl sounded that morning. He wasn't scared exactly. He was confused, like he was seeing something he didn't have words for." When asked what he believed happened, Alley was quiet for a long moment. "I don't believe anything," he finally said. "I just know what I heard, and I know those men didn't come home." The Coast Guard investigation lasted 4 months. The final report, issued in December of 1987, concluded that the 3 men had likely fallen overboard under undetermined circumstances. No cause was established. No contributing factors were identified. The case was classified as open but inactive. Several details from the investigation were never released to the public, but were later obtained through Freedom of Information requests filed in 2003. Among them, all 3 men's wristwatches had stopped at exactly 6:53 a.m., 1 minute after Earl's final transmission. The watches were different brands, different ages, different mechanisms. 1 was digital, 2 were analog. All 3 had stopped at the same moment. The investigative team noted this detail but offered no explanation. A footnote in the file suggested the watches may have been exposed to a localized electromagnetic event, but no such event was recorded by any monitoring station in the region. Another detail, the Darlene Marie's compass, when examined, was found to be functioning normally. Technicians could not replicate the spinning behavior Earl had described. The compass was sent to a laboratory in Portland for further analysis. The results of that analysis were never included in the final report. A handwritten note in the file margin reads simply, "Inconclusive, no follow-up." Attempts to locate radar data from the morning of August 11th were unsuccessful. The nearest tracking station, located at a military installation in Cutler, reported a gap in its records for a 2-hour window beginning at 6:30 a.m. The gap was attributed to routine maintenance, though no maintenance had been scheduled. In 1991, a local historian named Margaret Crowley compiled a list of similar incidents dating back to the early 1900s. She identified 11 cases of boats that had departed Jonesport or nearby Beals Island and either vanished entirely or returned with missing crew under unclear circumstances. In 7 of those cases, fog was mentioned in the final transmissions or witness accounts. Crowley submitted her findings to the Maine State Archives and requested access to historical Coast Guard records. Her request was denied. She was told the records had been transferred to a federal repository and were no longer available for public review. She died in 2009. Her research notes were never recovered. Jonesport today looks much as it did in 1987. The harbor still fills with boats before dawn. The village still waits. But there are certain things the old-timers do not discuss with outsiders. Certain mornings when the air grows still and the water flattens to glass, and someone on the dock will look out toward Mistake Island and say nothing at all. The Darlene Marie was sold in 1989. The new owner repainted it, renamed it, and moved it to a harbor in New Hampshire. It sank in a storm 2 years later. No one was aboard. Roberta Hodgkins still lives in the house she shared with Earl. She keeps his watch in a drawer beside her bed. She has never replaced the battery. When asked why, she once told a neighbor, "It stopped when he did. It wouldn't be right to start it again." The fog still comes to Jonesport, as it does to every coastal village in Maine. Most days it is simply fog, but there are mornings, quiet mornings, when the wind dies and the sea holds its breath, when the fishermen glance at their compasses before heading out, just to be sure, just to see if anything is spinning. The disappearance of Earl Hodgkins, Dale Beale, and Thomas Falkingham remains officially unsolved. The Coast Guard file was last updated in 1994. No new evidence has been submitted. No new theories have been proposed. The case is still listed as open. The harbor is still quiet. The sea does not explain itself. Frenchman Bay opens like a wound along the eastern coast of Maine, a broad expanse of cold water framed by the granite shoulders of Mount Desert Island to the south and the low, marshy reaches of the Schoodic Peninsula to the east. The bay stretches nearly 12 miles from its innermost cove to the open Atlantic, narrowing at its mouth, where Egg Rock Light has warned mariners of submerged ledges since 1875. The town of Bar Harbor sits at the bay's southwestern edge, a summer colony for the wealthy that swells each year with tourists drawn to Acadia National Park. But the bay's northern shores belong to quieter communities: Lemoyne, Hancock, Sullivan, villages where lobstering and clamming still dictate the rhythm of daily life. These are not places that attract attention. They are places where people mind their own waters and expect others to do the same. Frenchman Bay has a reputation among local mariners, though it is rarely discussed openly. The bay's depth drops sharply in certain areas, plunging from 40 feet to over 150 in the span of a few boat lengths. Cold currents rise unpredictably from these trenches, creating isolated pockets of fog that appear and vanish without warning. Fishermen call these pockets ghost banks, fog that seems to have no meteorological cause, no connection to temperature or wind. The Wabanaki people, who have lived along these shores for thousands of years, have older names for such things, but those names are not shared with outsiders. In the autumn of 1954, something happened in Frenchman Bay that the people of Lemoyne still do not discuss with strangers. On the morning of October 7, 1954, a fog bank moved into Frenchman Bay approximately 2 hours before sunrise. This was not unusual for early autumn. What was unusual, according to later accounts, was the fog's behavior. It did not drift. It did not spread gradually from the water's surface. According to multiple witnesses, the fog arrived all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the bay. One moment, the pre-dawn darkness was clear enough to see the lighthouse beam sweeping from Egg Rock. The next, visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. 7 boats were on the water that morning, most of them lobstermen checking traps before the day's tourist traffic began. The vessels were spread across a 3-mile stretch of the bay's northern half, operating independently, their crews unaware of one another's positions. Between 5:15 and 5:40 a.m., all 7 boats reported the same thing: figures walking on the water. The accounts varied slightly in detail, but agreed on the essential facts. A line of shapes, human in form, dark against the pale fog, moving slowly across the surface of the bay, heading east toward open ocean. The figures did not appear to be swimming or wading. They moved upright in single file, at a pace one witness described as deliberate, like a funeral march. No one could say how many figures there were. Estimates ranged from 6 to more than 20. The fog made counting impossible. Raymond Foss, a 42-year-old lobsterman from Hancock, was among the first to see them. He later told investigators that he had initially assumed the shapes were seals, or perhaps debris caught in an unusual current. But as he watched, he realized the figures were moving against the tide. "Seals don't walk," he said, "and they don't walk in a line." He tried to radio the harbor master in Bar Harbor, but received only static. His compass, he noted, was jumping between headings, unable to settle. By the time the fog lifted, shortly after 8 a.m., all 7 boats had returned to shore. Their crews were shaken, but unharmed. One vessel, however, had not returned. The skiff belonged to Dorothy Westcott, a 63-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived alone in Lemoyne since the death of her husband in 1949. She was known locally as a careful and capable sailor who often went out before dawn to sketch the bay's wildlife in a leather-bound logbook she had kept for more than 30 years. Her skiff, a 14-foot wooden dory with a small outboard motor, was found drifting near the mouth of the bay at approximately 9:15 a.m. The motor was off. The oars were stowed. A thermos of tea sat upright in the bow, still half full. Dorothy Westcott was not aboard. Her logbook was recovered from a canvas satchel wedged beneath the rowing seat. The final entry was dated October 7, 1954. The handwriting was steady, unhurried. It read, "Fog came fast. Saw them at first light. A procession moving east. I thought they were fishermen at first, walking the flats. But there are no flats here. The water is 40 feet deep. They're not walking. They're waiting." The entry ended there. No further marks, no sign of distress. Search parties combed the bay for 3 days. Divers were brought in from Portland. Aircraft circled overhead. Dorothy Westcott's body was never found. Her neighbors struggled to make sense of the logbook's final words. Several told investigators that Dorothy had been in good health and good spirits. She had no history of mental illness, no reason to harm herself, no enemies anyone could name. "She was the sharpest woman I ever knew," said Margaret Hodgson, who had taught alongside Dorothy at Lemoyne Consolidated School for 12 years. If she wrote that she saw something, she saw something. Dorothy didn't make things up. When asked what she believed had happened, Margaret was silent for a long moment. "I think she went to look," she finally said. "I think she got too close." The Coast Guard investigation into Dorothy Westcott's disappearance was brief and inconclusive. The official report, filed in November of 1954, attributed her death to accidental drowning, cause undetermined. No mention was made of the figures reported by the 7 fishermen. No mention was made of her logbook entry. The testimonies of the other witnesses were collected, but never included in the final case file. A handwritten note attached to one deposition, Raymond Foss's, reads, "Witness account inconsistent with known phenomena. Recommend no further action." In 1961, a graduate student at the University of Maine named Philip Arsenault attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the incident for his thesis on maritime folklore. He interviewed 4 of the original witnesses, obtained partial copies of the Coast Guard file through a contact at the regional office, and submitted a formal request to the National Weather Service for atmospheric data from the morning of October 7th. The Weather Service responded that no data was available. Their records showed equipment malfunction at the nearest monitoring station from 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. that morning. Arsenault's thesis was rejected by his committee. He was advised to choose a less speculative topic. He left the program the following year and never returned to academia. His notes were donated to the Lemoyne Historical Society in 1987, where they remain in an uncatalogued box in the basement archives. Among those notes is a transcript of his final interview with Raymond Foss, conducted in February of 1962. "I've been on this bay my whole life," Foss said. "I've seen fog do strange things. I've seen light play tricks at dawn. But I know what I saw that morning. Those were people, walking, and they were going somewhere." Arsenault asked if Foss had any theory about what the figures might have been. Foss shook his head. "They weren't going anywhere," he said quietly. "They were already there. We just weren't supposed to see them." Dorothy Westcott's house in Lemoyne stood empty for nearly a decade after her disappearance. It was eventually purchased by a couple from Massachusetts who used it as a summer cottage until 1973, when they sold it without explanation and never returned to the area. The current owners, who bought the property in 1989, report nothing unusual. But they admit they have never asked their neighbors about the house's history. Some questions, they say, are better left unasked. Dorothy's logbook was returned to her only surviving relative, a niece in Bangor, in 1955. The niece kept it in a safety deposit box until her own death in 2001. It was then transferred to the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, where it remains in their permanent collection, available for viewing by appointment only. The final page is displayed under glass. The handwriting is neat and precise. The words are exactly as they were written nearly 70 years ago. They are not walking, they're waiting. No one has ever determined what Dorothy Westcott meant. No one has explained what she saw that morning or why she rode toward it instead of away. Frenchman Bay still fogs over on autumn mornings. The lobstermen still go out before dawn. Most of them know the story. Most of them have heard the old accounts. And on certain mornings when the fog comes fast and the water goes still, some of them swear they can see shapes moving just beyond the edge of visibility. Dark figures walking east in single file. They never follow. They never look too long. Some things, the old-timers say, are not meant to be seen, and some processions are not meant to be joined. The disappearance of Dorothy Westcott remains officially classified as accidental drowning. Her body has never been recovered. The Coast Guard file was closed in 1955 and has not been reopened. The 7 fishermen who reported seeing figures on the water that morning never recanted their accounts. 3 of them are still alive. None of them will speak about it publicly. Frenchman Bay is quiet now. It is always quiet. Some things return. That does not mean they come back. Stonington sits at the southern tip of Deer Isle, a fishing community of barely 1,000 souls, connected to the mainland by a narrow suspension bridge that sways in high winds. The town clings to a granite shoreline that drops steeply into Penobscot Bay, its harbor crowded with lobster boats and the skeletal frames of old wharves that have stood against the tides for more than a century. The people here are not given to sentiment. They name their boats after wives and daughters, paint them in colors that can be spotted from miles away, and speak of the sea the way farmers speak of drought, with respect, resignation, and a quiet understanding that some years simply take more than they give. Deer Isle has always been isolated. Before the bridge was built in 1939, residents relied on ferry service that was frequently disrupted by fog, ice, and storms. Even now, the island feels separate from the mainland in ways that have nothing to do with geography. There is a stillness here, a sense that time moves differently, that the old ways persist not out of nostalgia, but necessity. The waters around Stonington are treacherous. Submerged ledges rise without warning. Currents shift with the tides, which run fast and cold through the narrow channels between the outer islands. Fog is common, arriving suddenly and lingering for hours, sometimes days. Fishermen learn early to trust their instincts, to read the water's surface for signs of hidden danger, to know when to turn back. Most of the time, instinct is enough. Most of the time. On the morning of March 14, 1971, Harold Eaton and his son Michael departed Stonington Harbor aboard the Sweet Margaret, a 32-foot lobster boat named for Harold's late mother. Harold was 51 years old, a third-generation fisherman who had worked these waters since he was 14. Michael was 23, recently returned from 2 years in the Army, eager to take over the family business. The weather that morning was fair. Visibility was good. Harold planned to check a string of traps near the eastern edge of Ilo O, a route he had run hundreds of times without incident. He told his wife, Pauline, that he expected to be back by early afternoon. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Harold radioed the Stonington harbormaster to report his position. He was 3 miles southeast of Coombs Head, making good time. The water was calm. He mentioned nothing unusual. That was the last confirmed communication from the Sweet Margaret. At 9:20 a.m., a lobsterman named Vernon Billings reported seeing a fog bank forming near Ilo O, unusual for the time of year and the conditions. He described it as low and thick, sitting on the water like smoke. Within 15 minutes, the fog had spread across a 2-mile radius, obscuring the eastern approach to the island. Vernon tried to raise Harold on the radio. There was no response. By noon, Pauline Eaton had grown concerned. By 2 o'clock, she had contacted the Coast Guard. By nightfall, a full search was underway. The search continued for 6 days. Aircraft covered hundreds of square miles. Boats from Stonington, Rockland, and Camden joined the effort. Divers explored the ledges near Harold's last known position. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no debris, no bodies, no trace of the Sweet Margaret or her crew. On March 20th, the search was suspended. Harold and Michael Eaton were presumed lost at sea. Pauline Eaton did not hold a funeral. She told neighbors she would wait until something was found, until there was proof. Some in Stonington thought this was denial. Others understood. The sea does not always return what it takes. Sometimes waiting is all a person can do. 11 months passed. On the morning of February 9, 1972, a fisherman named Clyde Haskell was the first to spot the boat. He was heading out before dawn, navigating by the harbor lights, when he saw a vessel drifting near the entrance to Stonington Harbor. At first, he assumed it was a boat that had slipped its mooring overnight. Then he got closer. It was the Sweet Margaret. Clyde would later describe the moment to investigators with a steadiness that belied his confusion. "I knew that boat," he said. "I'd seen her 1,000 times. But something was wrong. She looked new, too new." The Sweet Margaret was immaculate. Her hull had been freshly painted, the same blue-gray Harold had always used, but brighter, cleaner, as if the paint had been applied days ago. Her deck was spotless. Her lines were coiled with military precision. The engine, when Clyde climbed aboard to investigate, was cool but functional. The fuel tank was full. There was no one aboard. The cabin was empty but orderly. A chart of Penobscot Bay lay open on the navigation table, unmarked. A coffee cup sat in the sink, dry and clean. The bunks were made. Everything was in place. Everything was wrong. Clyde radioed the harbor master. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered on the Stonington docks. Pauline Eaton was among them. She stood at the edge of the wharf, staring at the boat as it was towed in. Witnesses said she did not speak. She did not cry. She simply watched, her face unreadable. When the Sweet Margaret was secured, Pauline walked the length of the dock and stopped at the bow. She looked at the registration number painted on the hull. Then she turned to the harbor master and said, "That's not Harold's number." She was right. The Sweet Margaret's original registration number had been filed off, carefully, completely, leaving no trace. In its place, a new number had been painted in the same style, the same color, positioned exactly where the original had been. The Coast Guard ran the new number through their database. It did not match any vessel registered in the state of Maine. It did not match any vessel registered anywhere in the United States. The number, as far as federal records were concerned, did not exist. Investigators examined the boat for 3 weeks. They found no fingerprints other than Clyde Haskell's. They found no DNA evidence, no fibers, no hair, nothing to indicate who had been aboard or where the vessel had been for the past 11 months. The paint on the hull was analyzed by a laboratory in Boston. The results were inconclusive. The paint was consistent with marine-grade enamel available at any chandlery in New England, but the batch number did not match any shipment recorded by the manufacturer in 1971 or 72. The fuel in the tank was tested. It was clean, standard diesel, unremarkable in every way, except that the fuel filter showed no signs of use. The engine had a full tank of gas, but appeared to have never been run. A marine mechanic named Donald Robbins, who had serviced the Sweet Margaret for years, examined the engine at the request of Harold's family. "It's the same engine," he told investigators, "same serial number, same configuration. But it's like it just came off the factory line. No wear, no carbon buildup, no salt corrosion. I rebuilt this engine myself in '68. I know what it looked like. This isn't the same engine, but it is." He paused, rubbing his hands on a shop rag. "I don't know how else to explain it." The Coast Guard investigation concluded in April of 1972. The final report offered no explanation for the boat's reappearance, the altered registration number, or the condition of the vessel. Harold and Michael Eaton remained classified as presumed deceased, bodies not recovered. The Sweet Margaret was released to Pauline Eaton as next of kin. She refused to take it. "That's not Harold's boat," she told the harbor master. "I don't care what the paperwork says, that's not his boat, and I won't have it." The Sweet Margaret was sold at auction in June of 1972. The buyer was a man from New Hampshire named Gerald Poole, who intended to use it for recreational fishing. He renamed the vessel, repainted the hull, and moved it to a marina in Portsmouth. Within 3 months, Gerald Poole sold the boat again. He told the new buyer he had experienced mechanical difficulties and no longer felt comfortable on the water. When pressed for details, he declined to elaborate. The boat changed hands 4 more times over the next decade. Each owner kept it for less than a year. Each cited vague reasons for selling: engine trouble, scheduling conflicts, a change in circumstances. In 1983, the vessel sank during a storm off Cape Elizabeth. No one was aboard. The wreck was never salvaged. Pauline Eaton lived in Stonington until her death in 1994. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about her husband or son, and she discouraged others from asking. But once, in the summer of 1987, a journalist from a Portland newspaper visited Stonington to write a feature on the island's fishing history. He asked Pauline if she would share any memories of Harold. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I waited 11 months for that boat to come back, and when it did, I wished it hadn't." The journalist asked what she meant. Pauline looked out at the harbor where the lobster boats rocked gently at their moorings. "Whatever came back," she said, "it wasn't Harold's boat. It looked like it. It had his name on it, but it wasn't his. Something else sent it, something that wanted us to think he was coming home." She paused. "But Harold's not coming home. He's out there somewhere, and so is Michael, and I think they're still trying to find their way back." She did not explain further. She did not need to. The harbor was quiet that afternoon. The water was still. And somewhere beyond the outer islands, the fog was beginning to form. The disappearance of Harold and Michael Eaton remains officially unsolved. The Coast Guard file was closed in 1972 and has not been reopened. The origin of the replacement registration number has never been determined. No matching vessel has ever been located. The people of Stonington still speak of the incident, though rarely to outsiders. They remember the morning the boat came back. They remember the way it looked, too clean, too new, too perfect. And they remember Pauline Eaton standing alone on the dock, looking at something that wore her husband's name, but was not her husband's boat. Some things return. That does not mean they come back. Some men escape the sea. The sea does not forget. Cutler is a small fishing village on the easternmost edge of Maine, closer to the Canadian border than to any major American city. The town sits on a ragged peninsula that juts into the Bay of Fundy, where the tides are among the most extreme on Earth, and the fog rolls in so thick that locals joke you can cut it with a knife and sell it by the pound. The village has never been prosperous in the conventional sense. There are no tourist attractions, no quaint bed and breakfasts, no reason for outsiders to visit unless they have business with the lobsterman or the naval radio station that once operated on the outskirts of town. Cutler exists because the sea exists, and because some families have always made their living from these waters, generation after generation, asking nothing from the world except to be left alone. The fog here is different from the fog elsewhere on the Maine coast. It does not drift in gradually. It arrives sometimes in minutes, sometimes in seconds, swallowing boats and shorelines and entire islands as if drawing a veil across the world. Old-timers say the fog has a mind of its own. They say it chooses when to come and when to leave. They say some men are marked by it. Edwin Gross was one of the marked. Edwin was born in Cutler in 1929, the third son of a lobsterman who had been the third son of a lobsterman before him. By the time he was 16, Edwin had his own skiff. By 20, he had his own string of traps. By 30, he was known as one of the most capable watermen on the peninsula, steady, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who never took unnecessary risks and never came home empty-handed. His first incident occurred on the morning of September 8, 1962. Edwin departed Cutler Harbor before dawn, heading for a set of traps near Cross Island, approximately 4 miles offshore. The weather was clear when he left. By 7 a.m., according to his own account, a fog bank had materialized around his boat without warning. It didn't roll in, he told the harbor master later that day. It was just there. 1 second I could see the island, the next I couldn't see past the bow. Edwin cut his engine and waited. This was standard practice. In fog, this thick running blind was more dangerous than sitting still. He estimated he waited approximately 30 minutes. When the fog lifted, Edwin discovered he was more than 8 miles from his original position, drifting in open water south of Mackay Seal Island. His fuel tank, which had been 3/4 full when he departed, was nearly empty. His watch, which had read 7:15 when the fog arrived, now read 12:42. He had lost more than 5 hours. He had no memory of moving the boat. He had no memory of anything. The Coast Guard attributed the incident to disorientation and tidal drift. Edwin accepted this explanation, though he later admitted to his wife, Margaret, that something about it troubled him. The engine was warm, he told her. If I'd just been drifting, the engine would have been cold. But it was warm, like it had been running the whole time. The second incident occurred on June 3, 1965. Edwin was returning to Cutler from a routine trip when fog enveloped his vessel approximately 2 miles from shore. This time, he kept his engine running at idle, hoping to maintain his heading by compass. The compass, he reported, began spinning erratically within minutes of the fog's arrival. When the fog lifted nearly 3 hours later, Edwin found himself anchored in a small cove on the eastern side of Cross Island. He had no memory of dropping anchor. He had no memory of navigating to the cove. His hands, he noticed, were covered in a fine gray residue he could not identify. It washed off easily but left his skin feeling numb for several days. A doctor in Mackay examined Edwin and found nothing physically wrong. The numbness faded. The memories did not return. Edwin continued fishing, but his wife noticed a change. He became reluctant to go out before dawn. He began checking the weather obsessively, sometimes calling the Coast Guard station 3 or 4 times in a single morning. He started carrying a second compass, then a third, as if quantity could compensate for whatever had caused them to fail. Margaret later told a neighbor that Edwin had begun talking in his sleep, not words exactly, but sounds, low and rhythmic, like someone counting or reciting something in a language she didn't recognize. The third incident occurred on October 19th, 1968. This time, Edwin was not alone. His nephew, 17-year-old Patrick Dennison, had accompanied him on a trip to check traps near the outer ledges. The weather was overcast, but visibility was adequate. No fog was forecast. At approximately 10:30 a.m., fog descended on the boat with what Patrick would later describe as impossible speed. "It was like someone poured milk over us," Patrick told investigators. "I couldn't see Uncle Edwin, and he was standing 3 feet away," Patrick called out. Edwin did not respond. Patrick fumbled for the radio and tried to raise the Coast Guard. The radio produced only static, not the crackling static of a weak signal, but a low, steady hiss that Patrick said sounded almost like breathing. The fog lasted, by Patrick's estimate, approximately 40 minutes. When it lifted, Edwin was standing at the helm, both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. His eyes were open but unfocused. He did not respond when Patrick spoke to him. It took nearly 5 minutes for Edwin to return to awareness. When he did, he looked at Patrick with an expression the young man would never forget. "It's not done with me," Edwin said. "It's never going to be done." Edwin refused to explain what he meant. He turned the boat toward Cutler and did not speak again until they reached the harbor. That evening, Edwin Gross announced he was selling his boat. Within 2 weeks, he had liquidated his traps, his equipment, and his mooring rights. By November, he and Margaret had moved to Bangor, 60 miles inland. He never set foot on a boat again. For nearly 5 years, Edwin Gross lived quietly in a modest house on the outskirts of Bangor. He took a job as a custodian at a local school. He attended church on Sundays. He spoke rarely of his years as a fisherman and never of the incidents that had driven him from the water. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who kept his lawn trimmed and his opinions to himself. He and Margaret had no children. They had few visitors. They lived, by all accounts, an unremarkable life. On the evening of August 14, 1973, Edwin's neighbor, a retired postal worker named Arthur Townsend, noticed something unusual. Fog was forming around the Gross property. This was strange for several reasons. The evening was clear and warm, with no humidity to speak of. Bangor is not a coastal city. Fog is uncommon and rarely dense. Most importantly, the fog appeared to be confined entirely to Edwin's property. Arthur could see it clearly from his kitchen window, a thick white mass that enveloped the house and yard, but stopped precisely at the property line, as if held back by an invisible wall. Arthur considered calling the fire department, thinking there might be smoke from an unseen source, but the fog had no smell, no color variation, no indication of combustion. It simply sat there, motionless, while the rest of the neighborhood remained clear. Arthur went to bed around 10:30 p.m. The fog was still there. When he woke the next morning, it was gone. So was Edwin Gross. Margaret Gross told police she had gone to bed early with a headache and had not noticed the fog. She woke at approximately 6 a.m. to find Edwin's side of the bed empty. His shoes were still by the door. His wallet was on the nightstand. His reading glasses were folded on top of the book he had been reading, a history of naval navigation he had checked out from the public library. The back door was unlocked but showed no signs of forced entry. There were no footprints in the yard, no indication of struggle, no evidence that anyone other than Edwin had been on the property. Arthur Townsend gave a statement to police describing the fog he had witnessed. The responding officer noted the account, but did not include it in the official report. A handwritten annotation in the case file, discovered years later by a researcher, reads, "Witness account, not consistent with meteorological conditions, possible misidentification or exaggeration. A search was conducted, dogs were brought in. They circled the property repeatedly, but could not pick up a trail. It was as if Edwin Gross had simply ceased to exist. Margaret Gross was interviewed multiple times over the following weeks. Her account never varied. She had not heard anything unusual. She had not seen the fog. She had simply woken up alone. When asked if she had any theory about what might have happened, Margaret was quiet for a long time. "He always said it wasn't done with him," she finally said. "I thought he was being dramatic. I thought once we left Cutler, it would be over. But it followed him. I don't know how. I don't know why. But it found him." She paused. "And now it's finished." The Bangor Police Department investigated Edwin Gross's disappearance for 8 months before suspending the case. No body was ever found. No suspects were ever identified. No explanation was ever offered. Margaret Gross remained in the house until her death in 1989. She never remarried. She rarely spoke of Edwin except once to a visiting niece, shortly before she died. "I used to think he ran away," she said. "Packed a bag and disappeared, started a new life somewhere. That would have been easier to accept. But his glasses were still on the nightstand. Edwin couldn't see without his glasses. He wouldn't have left them behind." She looked out the window at the yard where the fog had once gathered. He didn't leave. He was taken. And whatever took him had been waiting a long time. Arthur Townsend, the neighbor who witnessed the fog, moved away from Bangor in 1975. He never discussed the incident publicly, but his daughter found a journal entry written the week after Edwin's disappearance. "The fog lifted from the inside out," Arthur had written. "I watched it from my window at first light. It didn't drift away. It pulled back toward the center, toward the house, like water draining from a tub. And then it was gone, all of it, like it had finished what it came to do." Edwin Gross was declared legally dead in 1980. His case file was closed. The house in Bangor was sold 3 times over the following decade. None of the owners stayed long. In Cutler, the old fishermen still remember Edwin. They remember his skill, his steadiness, his quiet refusal to take risks. They remember the morning he came back from Cross Island with 5 hours missing from his life. And they remember what he said to his nephew on that final trip, the words Patrick Dennison carried with him for the rest of his life. "It's not done with me. It's never going to be done." The fog still comes to Cutler. It comes to all the villages along this coast. Most days it is simply fog, water vapor, temperature differentials, the ordinary mechanics of atmosphere and sea. But some days, the old-timers say, it feels different, heavier, more deliberate. Some days it feels like it's looking for someone. The disappearance of Edwin Gross remains officially unsolved. The Bangor police file was closed in 1974 and has not been reopened. Patrick Dennison, Edwin's nephew, continued fishing out of Cutler until his retirement in 2001. He never experienced another fog-related incident. He never forgot the words his uncle spoke that October morning. The house in Bangor still stands. The current owners report nothing unusual, but they say the yard never holds dew the way it should. The grass is always dry by morning, even when the rest of the street is wet, as if something had been there, and then lifted. The bell was the last thing anyone thought to look for. By then, everything else had already stopped making sense. Lubec is the easternmost town in the United States, a small fishing community perched on the edge of the continent where the waters of Passamaquoddy Bay meet the Bay of Fundy. The town sits so close to Canada that residents can see the cliffs of Campobello Island from their front porches, and on quiet nights, they can hear the foghorns from the Canadian lighthouses across the channel. The waters here are among the most challenging on the Atlantic seaboard. Tidal ranges exceed 20 feet. Currents run swift and unpredictable through the narrow passages between islands. Whirlpools form without warning near the confluence of opposing tides. Fishermen who work these waters learn early that the sea here does not forgive mistakes, and sometimes it does not forgive even perfection. Lübeck has always been a working town. At its peak in the late 19th century, the community supported more than 20 sardine canneries and a population of nearly 3,000. By 1989, the canneries were gone, the population had dwindled to fewer than 2,000, and the remaining residents made their living the way their grandparents had, pulling lobster traps, harvesting sea urchins, and running the occasional charter for tourists who wanted to see the whales that migrated through the bay each summer. The people of Lübeck do not speak often of what happened to the Mary Eliza, but they remember. They all remember. The Mary Eliza was a 32-foot wooden trawler built in 1971 at a boatyard in Eastport and named for the wife of her original owner. By 1989, she had passed through 3 owners and was registered to a Lübeck fisherman named Kenneth Morang, who had purchased her 5 years earlier and restored her with meticulous care. Kenneth was 47 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had returned to Lübeck after his service and taken up the trade his father had practiced before him. He was known as a careful captain, methodical and unhurried, the kind of man who checked his equipment twice before every trip and never went out when the weather looked questionable. On the morning of September 15, 1989, Kenneth departed Lübeck Harbor with 3 other men, his brother-in-law, Walter Prescott, age 52, a deckhand named James Corbett, age 34, and a young fisherman named Daniel Sullivan, age 26, who had recently moved to the area from Eastport. The 4 men planned to spend the day trawling for groundfish in the waters south of Grand Manan Island, a routine trip that Kenneth had made dozens of times before. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy skies, light winds from the northwest, and good visibility. There was no mention of fog. At approximately 11:45 a.m., Kenneth radioed the Lübeck harbormaster to report his position. He was 6 miles southeast of Quoddy Head, heading toward the fishing grounds. His tone was relaxed. He mentioned that the water was calm and that they expected a good haul. At approximately 1:15 p.m., the National Weather Service station in Caribou recorded an anomaly. A fog bank had been detected by satellite imagery approximately 3 miles east of Quoddy Head. This was not unusual in itself. Fog is common in these waters, particularly in late summer. What was unusual was the fog's movement. It was traveling west-northwest, directly against the prevailing wind. A meteorologist named Sandra Houghton flagged the observation and attempted to contact the Coast Guard station at Eastport. By the time she reached them, the fog bank had expanded to cover an area of approximately 12 square miles. It continued to move against the wind for another 40 minutes before dissipating. No explanation was ever provided. The incident was logged as an atmospheric anomaly and filed without further investigation. The Mary Eliza did not return to Lübeck that evening. Kenneth's wife, Donna, contacted the harbormaster at approximately 7 p.m., concerned that the boat had not appeared at its usual mooring. The harbormaster attempted to raise the vessel by radio. There was no response. A search was initiated the following morning. Coast Guard cutters and local fishing boats scoured the waters between Lübeck and Grand Manan Island. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the bay. Canadian authorities were notified and joined the effort. On the afternoon of September 18th, 3 days after the Mary Eliza's departure, a lobsterman named Rodney Flagg spotted the vessel grounded on rocks near the base of West Quoddy Head, less than 2 miles from Lübeck Harbor. The boat was intact but listing heavily to starboard, her hull wedged between 2 granite ledges. The engine was off. The fuel tank was nearly empty. The radio was functional but had been switched off. All 4 life jackets were still stowed in the forward compartment, untouched. The cabin showed no signs of struggle, no indication of illness or injury, no evidence that anything had gone wrong. Charts were spread on the navigation table, coffee mugs sat in the sink. A half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper rested on the helm console. The 4 men were gone. Coast Guard investigators spent 3 days examining the vessel. They found no blood, no damage consistent with collision or capsizing, no indication of how or why the crew had abandoned ship, if indeed they had abandoned it at all. Only one item was missing, the ship's bell. The Mary Eliza's bell was a brass fixture that had been mounted on the forward deck since the vessel's construction. It weighed approximately 15 pounds and was secured with 4 stainless steel bolts that passed through the deck and were fastened from below. When investigators examined the mounting location, they found that the bolts were still in place. The bell had not been unbolted, it had not been cut free. It was simply gone. The bolt holes showed no signs of stress or damage. The deck planking around the mounting plate was undisturbed. There were no tool marks, no scratches, no indication that anyone had attempted to remove the bell by force. A marine surveyor named Clement Brooks, hired by the families to conduct an independent examination, described the finding in his report. The bell appears to have been removed without disturbing its mounting hardware. I have no explanation for how this was accomplished. The bolts remained seated in their original positions, tightened to factory specifications. The mounting plate shows no evidence of tampering. It is as if the bell simply ceased to exist while remaining attached to the deck. Brooks submitted his report to the Coast Guard in November of 1989. It was acknowledged but never addressed in the official investigation. When asked about the bell during a follow-up interview, a Coast Guard spokesman stated only that the significance of the missing bell has not been determined, and that the investigation is focused on locating the 4 missing crewmen. The crewmen were never located. Donna Morang, Kenneth's widow, spent the months following the disappearance searching for answers that never came. She contacted the National Weather Service about the fog bank that had moved against the wind. She was told the incident had been logged, but that no further analysis had been conducted. They said it was a measurement error, Donna told a reporter from the Bangor Daily News in an interview published in February of 1990. But I spoke to Sandra Houghton, the meteorologist who flagged it. She said she watched it on the satellite feed for nearly an hour. She said she'd never seen anything like it. Donna also attempted to obtain radar data from the afternoon of September 15th. The Coast Guard informed her that radar coverage of the area had been intermittent that day due to equipment maintenance at the Eastport station. No records were available for the time period in question. Every time I asked a question, the answer was the same, Donna said. We don't know. We can't explain it. We have no records. After a while, I stopped asking, not because I didn't want answers, because I realized no one was going to give them to me. Walter Prescott's wife, Helen, never spoke publicly about the disappearance. She died in 1997. Her obituary made no mention of her husband's fate. James Corbett had no immediate family. His belongings were claimed by a cousin in Portland who donated most of them to charity. A box of personal effects, including photographs and letters, was transferred to the Lubeck Historical Society, where it remains in storage. Daniel Sullivan's parents, who lived in Eastport, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Coast Guard in 1991, alleging that inadequate radar coverage had contributed to their son's death. The case was dismissed in 1993. The judge ruled that no causal connection could be established between the radar maintenance and the disappearance. The Mary Eliza was salvaged in October of 1989 and towed to a boatyard in Eastport for inspection. The hull was found to be structurally sound. The engine, though fouled with seawater, was repairable. The vessel could have been restored to service. No one wanted her. The boat sat in the yard for nearly 2 years, her paint fading, her woodwork warping in the salt air. In 1991, she was purchased at auction by a marine salvage company from New Brunswick. They stripped her of usable hardware and scrapped the hull. The brass fittings, the navigation equipment, the helm console, All were sold or recycled. But the bell was never found. No one reported seeing it. No one claimed to have taken it. It simply was not there. A diver named Marcus Pelletier searched the rocks near West Quoddy Head in the summer of 1990, hoping to locate the bell or any other evidence that might have fallen from the vessel during its grounding. He found nothing, no bell, no debris, no personal effects from the crew. "I've done recovery work for 20 years, Pelletier told a local newspaper. Usually you find something, a shoe, a tackle box, something. But there was nothing down there, nothing at all. It was like the boat had been empty the whole time." Lubeck is quieter now than it was in 1989. The population has continued to decline. The young people leave for Portland or Boston or Point South, seeking opportunities that the fishing industry can no longer provide. But the old-timers remain, and they still talk about the Mary Eliza, though only among themselves, and only in certain contexts: late nights at the harbor, early mornings before the boats go out, moments when the fog rolls in and the water goes still. They talk about the fog that moved against the wind. They talk about the 4 men who vanished without a trace. They talk about the bell that disappeared from its mounting without disturbing a single bolt. And they talk about what Rodney Flagg said when he first boarded the grounded vessel before the Coast Guard arrived, before the investigators and the reporters and the questions that would never be answered. He said the boat was silent, completely silent. No creak of wood, no lap of water against the hull, no wind in the rigging, just silence. And then very faintly, from somewhere he could not identify, he heard a bell, a single tone, low and clear, as if rung from a great distance. He never heard it again. He never told the investigators. He only mentioned it once, years later, to a nephew who was about to take his first job on a fishing boat. "Listen for the bell," Rodney told him. "If you ever hear a bell that isn't there, you turn around. You come home. You don't ask questions. You just come home." The nephew asked what would happen if he didn't. Rodney was quiet for a long time. "Then maybe you don't come home at all." The disappearance of Kenneth Morang, Walter Prescott, James Corbett, and Daniel Sullivan remains officially unsolved. The Coast Guard file was closed in 1991 and has not been reopened. The ship's bell of the Mary Eliza has never been recovered. No explanation has been offered for its disappearance. The fog bank observed on September 15, 1989, was never explained. The National Weather Service file on the incident remains classified as anomalous atmospheric event, cause undetermined. Lubeck Harbor is quiet these days. The boats still go out. The traps still come in. The fog still rolls across the water without warning. And sometimes, on certain mornings, the fishermen pause before starting their engines, listening, just in case. Children see things differently. Sometimes that is a blessing. Sometimes it is not. Vinalhaven is an island 12 miles off the coast of Rockland, Maine, accessible only by ferry or private boat. The island stretches roughly 8 miles long and 5 miles wide, its granite shores dotted with fishing wharves, summer cottages, and the quiet homes of families who have lived here for generations. In winter, the population drops to barely 1,000. In summer, it swells with tourists and seasonal residents who come for the lobster, the silence, and the particular quality of light that painters have tried to capture for more than a century. The ferry is the island's lifeline. It runs 3 times daily in the off-season, more frequently in summer, carrying cars, trucks, supplies, and the people who depend on that narrow passage of water to connect them to the mainland. The crossing takes approximately 75 minutes in good weather. In fog, it can take longer. In heavy fog, the ferry sometimes does not run at all. The crew members who work the Vinalhaven ferry are a tight-knit group, many of them islanders themselves, men and women who know every rock, every current, every shift in the wind that signals a change in conditions. They take pride in their work. They take pride in their safety record. In the decades since the modern ferry service began, there had never been a passenger lost overboard, never a serious accident, never an incident that could not be explained by mechanical failure or human error, until October of 1996. Marcus Harding was 34 years old, a Vinyl Haven native, who had worked as a deckhand on the ferry for nearly 8 years. He was known as a reliable employee, a devoted father, and a man who rarely missed a shift. He lived in a small house near Carver's Harbor with his son, Elijah, age 6, whom he was raising alone following his divorce 2 years earlier. On the morning of October 7, 1996, Marcus reported for the 6 a.m. crossing from Vinyl Haven to Rockland. This was unusual. He typically worked the later shifts, but he had traded schedules with a colleague who needed the day off for a family matter. Marcus brought Elijah with him, as he often did on early mornings when childcare was unavailable. The boy would ride the ferry to Rockland and back, doing homework in the crew cabin or watching the water from the upper deck. The morning was foggy, not dangerously so, but thick enough that the captain, Warren Philbrook, reduced speed for the crossing. Visibility was estimated at approximately 200 feet. The ferry departed on schedule at 6:15 a.m. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing Marcus on the vehicle deck as the ferry cleared the harbor. He was wearing his standard uniform, dark blue jacket, orange safety vest, work boots. He was carrying a clipboard, checking the tie-downs on the vehicles as he did at the start of every crossing. Elijah was with him, holding his father's free hand. At approximately 6:30 a.m., Marcus brought Elijah to the crew cabin on the upper deck and asked a colleague, a woman named Patricia Osgood, to keep an eye on the boy while he completed his rounds. Patricia agreed. Marcus kissed his son on the forehead and left. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus Harding. The ferry arrived at the Rockland terminal at approximately 7:35 a.m. Passengers disembarked. Vehicles drove off. The crew began preparing for the return crossing. Patricia Osgood realized that Marcus had not returned for his son. She searched the crew areas, then the passenger cabin, then the vehicle deck. She asked other crew members if they had seen him. No one had, not since the early part of the crossing. She informed Captain Philbrook, who ordered a thorough search of the vessel. Marcus was not aboard. At approximately 8 a.m., Patricia went to collect Elijah from the crew cabin, where she had left him with a coloring book and a cup of juice. The boy was not there. A deckhand found him 12 minutes later, standing alone at the end of the Rockland ferry dock, approximately 40 feet from the vessel. The fog had thickened since their arrival, reducing visibility to less than 100 feet. The boy was facing the water, his right arm extended, index finger pointing toward something in the fog. He was not crying. He was not speaking. He was simply pointing. The deckhand, a young man named Kevin Doughty, approached the boy slowly and knelt beside him. "Elijah, where's your dad?" The boy did not respond. He did not lower his arm. He continued pointing at the empty water. Kevin followed the direction of the boy's finger. There was nothing there, just fog and the faint sound of waves against the pilings. "Elijah, buddy, what are you looking at?" The boy finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "Daddy got off early." The Coast Guard was notified within the hour. A search was launched, covering the waters between Vinyl Haven and Rockland, the shorelines of both harbors, and the open bay beyond. Divers were deployed near the ferry terminal. Aircraft circled overhead, though the fog limited their effectiveness. Marcus Harding was never found. Investigators initially treated the case as a possible suicide or accidental drowning. Marcus had no history of mental illness, no financial troubles, no indication that he might harm himself, but the sea does not always require reasons. Sometimes men simply go overboard. Sometimes they are never recovered. The theory was complicated by the ferry's manifest. According to the official passenger and crew log, Marcus Harding had completed the crossing. His name appeared on the arrival manifest, signed by the purser, indicating that all crew members had been accounted for when the vessel docked in Rockland. But Marcus had not been accounted for. He had not signed out. He had not reported to his station for the return crossing. He had not been seen by anyone after 6:30 a.m. The purser, a man named Donald Bridges, was questioned repeatedly about the discrepancy. He insisted he had followed standard procedure, checking names against the crew list as the ferry docked. He could not explain how Marcus's name had been marked as present when Marcus was not aboard. "I remember checking the list," Donald said. "I remember seeing his name. I remember marking it. But I don't remember seeing him. I just assumed he was there, like he always was." Security footage from the Vinyl Haven terminal provided the only visual record of Marcus's final movements. The cameras, installed 2 years earlier as part of a state-funded safety upgrade, covered the dock, the vehicle ramp, and a portion of the ferry's exterior. Footage from the morning of October 7th showed Marcus arriving at the terminal with Elijah at approximately 5:50 a.m. They walked together toward the ferry, the boy's hand in his father's. At 6:12 a.m., as the fog began to roll in more heavily, the camera captured Marcus walking toward the vehicle deck ramp. Elijah was no longer with him, presumably already in the crew cabin with Patricia Osgood. Marcus paused at the edge of the frame. He appeared to turn his head as if looking at something off camera. He stood motionless for approximately 11 seconds. Then he walked forward into the fog and disappeared from view. The next frame, captured 4 seconds later, showed the same scene. The fog, the ramp, the edge of the ferry's hull. No Marcus. Investigators reviewed the footage repeatedly, frame by frame. There was no indication that Marcus had boarded the ferry. There was no indication that he had turned back. He had simply walked into the fog and not emerged. The Rockland terminal cameras showed passengers disembarking 75 minutes later. Marcus was not among them. No figure matching his description appeared anywhere in the footage. "It's like he walked into the fog and the fog kept him," said a state police detective who worked the case. "I've watched that tape 100 times. He doesn't board the ferry. He doesn't turn around. He just stops being there." Elijah Harding was examined by a child psychologist in the weeks following his father's disappearance. The sessions were conducted at the request of the boy's maternal grandmother, who had assumed custody. Dr. Miriam Hollis, a specialist in childhood trauma based in Portland, met with Elijah on 4 occasions. Her notes, later obtained through a court proceeding related to the custody arrangement, offer the only detailed account of the boy's perspective. In their first session, Elijah was largely nonverbal. He drew pictures, fog, water, the ferry, but would not discuss them. In the second session, he began to speak, though his responses were brief and often difficult to interpret. Doctor. Hollis asked him about the morning his father disappeared. "Daddy had to go," Elijah said. "Go where?" "To where the people were." "What people, Elijah?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. "The people in the water. They were waiting for him." Dr. Hollis asked if Elijah had seen these people. The boy nodded. "They were standing in the fog. Daddy walked to them. He waved at me. Then they all walked away." "Walked where?" Elijah pointed downward. "Under." Dr. Hollis documented the conversation, but noted that the boy showed no signs of distress or fabrication. His account was consistent across multiple sessions. He spoke of the people in the water as if describing something entirely ordinary, not frightening, not supernatural, simply factual. In their final session, Dr. Hollis asked Elijah why he had been pointing at the water when the deckhand found him. "I was showing Daddy where to go," the boy said. "He forgot the way." The investigation into Marcus Harding's disappearance was officially suspended in March of 1997. The case was classified as presumed drowning, circumstances undetermined. No body was ever recovered. No evidence of foul play was ever established. No explanation was ever offered for the manifest discrepancy or the security footage anomaly. The ferry continued to run. The crew continued to work. Life on Vinalhaven continued as it always had, though some of the older residents noticed that certain deckhands were more careful now, more attentive to the fog, more inclined to keep their colleagues in sight during crossings. Captain Warren Philbrook retired in 2001. In an interview with a maritime history project conducted by the Maine Maritime Museum, he was asked about the Harding case. His response was brief. "I've been on the water my whole life. I've seen fog do strange things. I've seen men make mistakes, but I've never seen a man walk into fog and not come out the other side. I don't know what happened to Marcus. I don't think anyone does. I don't think anyone ever will." Elijah Harding grew up in the custody of his grandmother, first in Rockland, later in Augusta. He reportedly struggled in school, had difficulty forming friendships, and was diagnosed with anxiety disorder in his early teens. At 18, he legally changed his name. At 22, he moved out of state. His current whereabouts are not publicly known. His grandmother, in a rare interview given to a local newspaper in 2008, said that Elijah never forgot what happened on the dock that morning. "He still talks about it sometimes," she said. "Not often, but sometimes. He says his father didn't drown. He says his father went with them, the people in the water. He says they were waiting for him, and he went." She paused, folding her hands in her lap. "I don't know what he saw that day. I don't know what any of it means, but I know my grandson. He doesn't lie. He never has. Whatever happened to Marcus, Elijah saw it, and he's been carrying it ever since." The Rockland Ferry Terminal was renovated in 2012. The old security cameras were replaced. The footage from October 7, 1996, was transferred to digital storage and archived by the Maine State Police. It has not been reviewed since. The fog still comes to Penobscot Bay. It rolls in without warning, thick and white, blurring the line between water and sky. The ferries still run, carrying passengers and cargo between the mainland and the islands. And sometimes, on certain mornings, a deckhand will pause at the ramp and look out into the gray, not searching for anything, just looking, just making sure the fog is empty, because sometimes, they say, it is not. The disappearance of Marcus Harding remains officially unsolved. The Maine State Police file was suspended in 1997 and has not been reopened. The ferry manifest discrepancy was never explained. The security footage has never been conclusively interpreted. Elijah Harding has not spoken publicly about his father since childhood. His whereabouts are unknown. The people of Vinalhaven do not often discuss the case, but they remember the boy on the dock standing in the fog, pointing at nothing anyone else could see. They remember what he said. "Daddy got off early." And they remember that the fog that morning did not lift for a very long time. Silence on the water is never empty. It is filled with what should be there and is not. Tennant's Harbor lies along the western shore of the St. George Peninsula, a quiet fishing community of fewer than 200 year-round residents tucked into one of the countless inlets that scallop Maine's mid-coast. The harbor itself is small and well protected, shielded from the open Atlantic by a series of granite islands that break the worst of the winter swells. Lobstermen have worked these waters for generations, their families rooted in the same coves and points that their great-grandparents once called home. The village takes its name from an early settler, though which settler and which century depend on whom you ask. The locals do not concern themselves much with history. They concern themselves with tides and temperatures, with the price of bait and the condition of their traps, with the slow accumulation of seasons that defines a life lived close to the sea. The harbor has a single general store, a small post office, and a white clapboard church that has stood on the same hill since 1847. There is no hotel, no restaurant, no reason for outsiders to stop unless they have business with the fishermen or have lost their way on the winding coast road. It is the kind of place where nothing happens. until it does. On the morning of March 12, 1981, the weather along the St. George Peninsula was unremarkable. Skies were overcast, winds light from the northeast, temperatures hovering just above freezing. A fog advisory had been issued for the afternoon, but the morning was clear enough for the lobster fleet to head out as usual. 7 boats departed Tennant's Harbor between 5 and 6 a.m., spreading across the fishing grounds that extended south toward Mosquito Island and east toward the open waters of Penobscot Bay. Most planned to work until early afternoon, returning before the fog was expected to arrive. The fog came early. At approximately 10:15 a.m., fishermen across the region reported a sudden and dramatic reduction in visibility. The fog did not roll in gradually, as coastal fog typically does. It descended, according to multiple accounts, like a blanket being dropped. Within minutes, visibility dropped from several miles to less than 50 feet. Standard procedure in such conditions was to anchor and wait, maintaining radio contact with the harbor master and other vessels. The Tennant's Harbor fleet followed this protocol. At 10:22 a.m., the harbor master, a man named Russell Dennison, logged a routine check-in with all 7 boats. Each captain confirmed his position and reported no distress. At 10:23 a.m., all radio contact ceased. Russell attempted to raise each vessel individually. There was no response. He switched frequencies, checked his equipment, tried again. Nothing. Not static, not interference, simply silence, as if every radio in the fleet had been switched off simultaneously. He contacted the Coast Guard station in Rockland. They reported the same phenomenon. All marine radio traffic in a roughly 15-mile radius around Tennant's Harbor had stopped. Commercial vessels, recreational boats, even the Coast Guard's own communications within the affected area, all silent. The silence lasted exactly 42 minutes. At 11:05 a.m., radio contact resumed as suddenly as it had ceased. Russell immediately began hailing the Tennant's Harbor fleet. 5 boats responded, their captains confused and shaken, but unharmed. They reported the same experience: radios that had suddenly stopped working, compasses that had behaved erratically, a fog so thick they could not see their own hands in front of their faces. 2 boats did not respond. The Catherine Anne, captained by 56-year-old Bernard Toussaint, and the Sea Spray, captained by 41-year-old Douglas Plourde, had been working adjacent sections of the fishing grounds approximately 3 miles south of the harbor. Both men were experienced, both boats were well maintained, and both had confirmed their positions during the 10:22 a.m. check-in. Neither responded to any subsequent hails. The fog began to lift at approximately 1:30 p.m. Coast Guard vessels and local boats immediately launched a search. The Catherine Anne and Sea Spray were found within the hour, anchored side by side in a small cove on the eastern shore of Mosquito Island. The boats were not drifting. They were anchored precisely and deliberately, their bows pointed in the same direction, their anchor lines taut. The spacing between them was exact, approximately 12 feet, as if measured. From a distance, they looked like boats waiting for their crews to return from a brief errand ashore. But there was no shore. Mosquito Island is uninhabited, a treeless granite outcrop that supports nothing but seabirds and lichen. There is nowhere to go, nothing to do, no reason for any fisherman to anchor there. The first responders to board the vessels were Coast Guard petty officers Wayne Shelton and Maria Fontaine. They would later provide detailed statements to investigators, statements that have never been fully explained. The Sea Spray appeared undisturbed. The engine was off, the fuel tank half full. Traps were stacked neatly on the deck, ready to be deployed. Douglas Plourde's coffee thermos sat on the helm console, still warm to the touch. His jacket hung on a hook by the cabin door. His boots were beside the captain's chair. Douglas was not aboard, nor was his deckhand, a 23-year-old man named Christopher Beale. The Catherine Anne presented a similar scene. Equipment in order, engine off, no signs of struggle. Bernard Toussaint's pipe rested in an ashtray on the navigation table, still fragrant with the tobacco he favored. His reading glasses were folded beside a tide chart. Everything suggested a man who had stepped away for a moment and would return shortly. He did not return. Neither did his deckhand, a 40-year-old man named Philip Dumont. 4 men, 2 boats. No explanation. But there was one detail that set the Catherine Anne apart. On the interior wall of the wheelhouse, scratched into the painted wood with what appeared to be a knife or a sharp tool, was a single sentence: "It knows where we live." The letters were uneven, hurried, cut deep enough to splinter the wood. Coast Guard investigators photographed the message and attempted to determine who had written it. The handwriting, if it could be called handwriting, was inconsistent with samples obtained from Bernard Toussaint's personal papers. It did not match any of the other missing men. Forensic analysis was inconclusive. The tool used to make the marks was never identified. The message itself was never explained. The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately fruitless. Divers searched the waters around Mosquito Island and found nothing. No bodies, no debris, no equipment that might have fallen overboard. Dogs were brought to the island itself, but the granite offered no scent trail, no footprints, no indication that anyone had set foot there. Interviews with the 5 surviving captains revealed a consistent pattern of anomalies during the 42 minutes of silence. All reported that their compasses had spun erratically. All reported that the fog had seemed unusually dense, unusually cold, and unusually still. No wind, no wave action, no sense of movement in any direction. 2 captains reported hearing sounds during the silence. Frederick Hatch, captain of the Morning Star, described a low humming that seemed to come from beneath his boat. Lawrence Simmons, captain of the Abigail Rose, reported what he called voices, but not words, a rhythmic murmuring that he could not localize or identify. Neither man was willing to elaborate further. Neither man was willing to discuss the experience with anyone outside the immediate investigation. The families of the missing men demanded answers. The Coast Guard could provide none. The case was classified as disappearance under unexplained circumstances and remained open, technically, though no new leads were ever developed. In May of 1981, the Bangor Daily News published a feature article on the incident. The reporter, a woman named Janet Whitmore, interviewed Russell Dennison, the harbor master who had witnessed the radio silence firsthand. 42 minutes, Russell said. I've thought about that number every day since. Why 42? Why not 40 or 45? There's something precise about it, something deliberate, like whatever happened, it happened on a schedule. Janet asked if he had any theory about what might have caused the silence. Russell was quiet for a long moment. I've been on the water my whole life, he said. I've seen equipment fail. I've seen weather do strange things. But I've never seen every radio in a 15-mile radius go silent at the same moment. That's not a malfunction. That's not interference. That's something else. Something else like what? Russell shook his head. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. The families of the 4 missing men held a memorial service in June of 1981 at the White Clapboard Church on the hill. The church was full. The service was brief. No bodies were buried, because no bodies were ever found. Bernard Toussaint's widow, a woman named Claire, spoke at the service. Her remarks were not recorded, but those who attended remember one thing she said. Bernard spent his whole life on the water. He knew it better than he knew his own house. If something could take him, it could take any of us. That's what I keep thinking. It knows where we live. That's what the message said. And I think it was telling the truth. The phrase became a kind of local shorthand, a way of acknowledging the unacknowledged. When fishermen gathered at the general store or the harbor, when the fog rolled in unexpectedly, when the radio crackled with static that sounded almost like voices, someone would mutter it under their breath. It knows where we live. No one ever said what "it" was. No one ever asked. The Catherine Ann and the Sea Spray were eventually claimed by the families and sold. The Catherine Ann was purchased by a fisherman from Spruce Head who renamed her and repainted her hull. He sold her within a year, citing unspecified problems he declined to discuss. The boat changed hands twice more before sinking in a storm off Matinicus in 1989. The Sea Spray met a different fate. Douglas Plourd's brother, who inherited the vessel, refused to sell it. He towed it to a private wharf and left it there, untouched, for more than a decade. When he died in 1993, his children had the boat dismantled. The section of the Catherine Ann's wheelhouse wall that bore the scratched message was removed during the Coast Guard investigation and retained as evidence. It was stored at the Rockland Station until 1996, when it was transferred to a federal archive in Massachusetts. A researcher who requested access to the artifact in 2004 was informed that it could not be located. The chain of custody records showed the transfer, but the receiving facility had no record of ever receiving it. The message, like the men who may have written it, had vanished. Tennant's Harbor remains a fishing village. The boats still go out. The fog still comes. The radios still work most days, though old-timers say they sometimes catch strange sounds on certain frequencies, sounds that might be voices, might be static, might be nothing at all. Russell Dennison retired from his harbormaster position in 1994. He still lives in Tennant's Harbor, in a small house overlooking the water. He does not grant interviews. He does not discuss March 12th, 1981. But his neighbors say he keeps a radio on his kitchen table tuned to the old marine frequencies. They say he listens sometimes late at night, when the fog is thick and the harbor is quiet. They say he is waiting for something. They do not ask what. The 42 minutes of silence have never been explained. The National Weather Service has no record of atmospheric conditions that might have caused such widespread radio interference. The Coast Guard has no precedent for the phenomenon, no similar incidents in their files, no theory that accounts for the facts. 4 men vanished. 2 boats were found anchored in perfect formation. A message was scratched into a wall by an unknown hand. It knows where we live. The people of Tennant's Harbor do not speak of it often, but they remember. And on certain mornings when the fog comes early, when the radios crackle with sounds that are not quite static, when the silence seems to press against the windows like something waiting to be let in, they remember what Russell Dennison said. That's not a malfunction. That's not interference. That's something else. And they wonder, quietly, if the silence is listening, if it remembers them, too. The disappearance of Bernard Toussaint, Douglas Plourd, Christopher Beale, and Philip Dumont remains officially unsolved. The Coast Guard file was suspended in 1982 and has not been reopened. The cause of the 42-minute radio silence has never been determined. The message scratched into the wheelhouse wall of the Catherine Ann has never been explained. The artifact itself has been missing since sometime before 2004. Tennant's Harbor is quiet now. It is always quiet. But some silences, the old-timers say, are louder than others. The island has always listened. Some nights it answers. Monhegan lies 10 miles off the coast of Maine, a granite outcrop rising from the Atlantic, like the back of some ancient creature frozen mid-breach. The island is barely 1.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide, its surface dominated by cathedral woods, a dense forest of spruce and fir, and by cliffs that drop more than 150 feet to the churning water below. There are no cars on Monhegan, no paved roads, no streetlights. The year-round population hovers around 65 souls, a number that swells to several hundred during the summer months when artists, tourists, and seasonal workers arrive on the daily ferry from Port Clyde. But by November, the summer people are gone. The ferry runs only 3 times a week, and Monhegan returns to its true self, isolated, windswept, and profoundly quiet. The island has attracted painters since the mid-19th century. Rockwell Kent lived here. Edward Hopper visited. Jamie Wyeth still maintains a studio on neighboring Manana Island. They came for the light, they said, the way the Atlantic reflects the sky, the way fog transforms the cliffs into something from a dream. But the locals know that Monhegan has other qualities, qualities that are harder to name. The island feels older than it should, heavier somehow, as if the granite holds memories that predate the first human footfall. The Wabanaki people knew this place for thousands of years before European contact. They called it Monchigan, a name whose meaning has been variously translated as Out to Sea Island or Island of the Sea. Some translations suggest a different meaning entirely, but those translations are not shared with outsiders. November of 2002 was colder than usual. The first hard frost came in late October, and by the second week of November, the island had emptied of all but its permanent residents. The ferry continued its abbreviated schedule, bringing mail and supplies twice weekly, but passenger traffic had dwindled to nearly nothing. On the evening of November 14th, a thick fog rolled in from the southeast. This was not unusual. Fog is common on Monhegan, particularly in autumn. But residents later noted that this fog had a particular quality. It was dense, yes, but also strangely warm. Condensation formed on windows and doors. The air felt heavy, almost liquid. At approximately 8:45 p.m., a year-round resident named Constance Rollins was walking back to her cottage from a neighbor's house when she heard something that made her stop. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, deliberate footsteps, moving somewhere in the fog to her left, toward the eastern shore where the cliffs dropped to Lobster Cove. Constance stood still and listened. The footsteps continued, unhurried, moving from north to south. She could not see their source. The fog was too thick. But the sound was unmistakable. Boots on stone, a steady cadence, like someone walking a patrol route. She called out. There was no response. The footsteps continued without pause, growing fainter as they moved toward the southern end of the island, then fading entirely. Constance hurried home and locked her door. Over the next 3 hours, at least 9 other residents reported hearing the same phenomenon. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Heavy footsteps, rhythmic, circling the island's perimeter. No visible source, no response to calls or shouts. The footsteps would grow louder, pass by, then fade, only to be heard again, minutes later, approaching from a different direction. It was like someone was walking the entire edge of the island, said Walter Pierce, a 73-year-old lobsterman who had lived on Monhegan his entire life. Over and over, the same pace, the same rhythm, but there was nobody there. I went out with a flashlight. I walked 50 feet in every direction. Nothing, just the fog and the sound of boots on rock. Among the handful of visitors still on the island that week was Dr. Helen Bancroft, a 38-year-old marine biologist from the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Bancroft had arrived on November 12th to conduct research on intertidal ecosystems in the island's tide pools. She was staying in a rented cottage near the island's southern tip, within earshot of the cliffs overlooking Gull Rock. Dr. Bancroft was known to her colleagues as meticulous, rational, and deeply skeptical of anything that could not be measured or observed. She kept detailed field notes, recorded her observations on a portable audio recorder, and approached her work with the dispassionate rigor of a scientist who trusted only evidence. On the evening of November 14th, she was in her cottage reviewing data when she first heard the footsteps. Her initial assumption, according to notes she left on her laptop, was that another researcher or resident was walking the perimeter path that circled parts of the island. She noted the sound at 9:17 p.m. and returned to her work. By 10:30 p.m., She had heard the footsteps pass her cottage 3 times. Her notes from that hour are fragmentary but revealing. 10:31 p.m. Footsteps again. Same cadence, same direction, N to S. No voices, no flashlight visible. Going to investigate. 10:47 p.m. Walk to cliff path. Fog extremely dense. Heard footsteps to the south approximately 100 meters. Called out. No response. Returning to cottage. 11:02 p.m. Footsteps passing cottage again. This is the 4th pass. Same rhythm exactly. Timing is consistent. Approximately 22 minutes between passes. Someone is deliberately circling the island, going out with recorder. That was the last entry in her notes. Dr. Bancroft's absence was not noticed until the following morning. A neighbor who had planned to meet her for coffee at 8 a.m. found the cottage door ajar and the interior undisturbed. Dr. Bancroft's laptop was on the kitchen table. Her jacket was on its hook. Her boots, the only pair she had brought, were beside the door. She had gone out into the fog without a coat or shoes. A search was organized within the hour. Every year-round resident participated, along with 2 seasonal caretakers who had remained on the island for maintenance work. They searched the cliffs, the woods, the beaches, every path and crevice on the island. Dr. Helen Bancroft was not found. What was found at approximately 2:15 p.m. was her audio recorder. It was resting on a flat rock at the edge of Whitehead Cliff, the island's highest point, overlooking a 160-foot drop to the Atlantic. The recorder was still running. It had been recording continuously for more than 15 hours. The search team did not listen to the recording immediately. They turned off the device, marked the location, and contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Department. A deputy arrived on the afternoon ferry, collected the recorder, and transported it to the mainland for analysis. The contents of that recording have never been officially released, but portions of it were transcribed during the subsequent investigation, and those transcriptions have circulated among researchers and journalists in the years since. The recording begins at 11:04 p.m. on November 14th. The first sounds are ambient, wind, the distant crash of waves, the crunch of gravel under what are presumably Dr. Bancroft's bare feet. For approximately 6 minutes, there is nothing unusual. Dr. Bancroft can be heard breathing steadily, occasionally muttering observations to herself. Fog thicker here. Path curves left. Can hear the surf below. At the 11-minute mark, she stops. Her breathing quickens slightly. Then, very clearly, the recording captures the sound of footsteps. Not her footsteps. These are heavy, rhythmic, deliberate, the same footsteps described by the island's residents. They are close, perhaps 20 or 30 feet away, and moving toward her. Dr. Bancroft does not speak. She does not run. The recording captures only her breathing and the approaching footsteps. The footsteps pass her. They do not stop. They continue southward, maintaining their steady rhythm, and gradually fade into the distance. For the next several minutes, Dr. Bancroft remains still. Then, faintly, she whispers, "Following." The recording continues for another 47 minutes. During this time, the footsteps are audible almost continuously, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always present. Dr. Bancroft does not speak again. Her breathing remains audible, growing slower, calmer, as if she has reached some kind of resolution. At the 58-minute mark, the footsteps stop. For approximately 2 minutes, the recording captures only wind and waves, and Dr. Bancroft's steady breathing. Then, very faintly, so faintly that audio analysts have debated whether it is real or an artifact of the equipment, a voice can be heard. It is not Dr. Bancroft's voice. It is deeper, older, and it speaks only 2 words: "Thank you." The recording continues for another 16 minutes. There is no further speech, no footsteps, no indication of movement. Just wind, just waves, just the slow mechanical hiss of the recorder's operation. At the 1 hour and 16-minute mark, there is a faint sound that some analysts have interpreted as a single footstep. Others believe it is Dr. Bancroft shifting position. Others believe it is nothing at all. The recording continues, uninterrupted, until the search team discovered it the following afternoon. The investigation into Dr. Bancroft's disappearance lasted 4 months. Divers searched the waters below Whitehead Cliff and found nothing. Cadaver dogs were brought to the island and detected no remains. Interviews with residents produced no leads, no suspects, no explanation. The Knox County Sheriff's Department classified the case as presumed accidental death, body not recovered. The official theory was that Dr. Bancroft had become disoriented in the fog, wandered too close to the cliff's edge, and fallen. The audio recording was not mentioned in the final report. Dr. Bancroft's family requested access to the recording and was initially denied. After a legal challenge, they were provided with a partial transcript, but not the audio itself. The transcript omitted the final 18 minutes. A Freedom of Information request filed in 2009 by a journalist from the Portland Press-Herald was denied on the grounds that the recording remained evidence in an open investigation. But the investigation had been closed since 2003. No explanation for the discrepancy was provided. The residents of Monhegan do not speak often of November 14, 2002. They do not discuss the footsteps they heard that night, or the scientist who followed them into the fog, or the recording that may or may not contain a voice that should not exist. But they remember. Constance Rollins, who heard the footsteps first, still lives on the island. She is 81 years old now and rarely speaks to outsiders. But she once told a visiting writer something that the writer later included in an article about Monhegan's history. "The island has always had walkers," Constance said. "That's what my grandmother called them, walkers." She said they come when the fog is thick, and they walk the edge of the island, and they're looking for something. She never said what. Maybe they don't know themselves. The writer asked if Constance believed her grandmother's stories. Constance was quiet for a long time. "I believe what I heard," she said finally. "I heard footsteps with no feet. I heard someone walking who wasn't there, and I heard that woman go out into the fog to find them." She paused. Maybe she did find them. Maybe that's worse. The fog still comes to Monhegan. It rolls in from the southeast, dense and damp, and transforms the island into something from a half-remembered dream. The cliffs disappear, the woods go silent, the world shrinks to the space between one breath and the next. And sometimes, on certain nights, the residents hear footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, deliberate, circling the island, looking for something or someone. They do not investigate. They do not call out. They lock their doors and wait for morning, and they do not speak of what they heard, because they remember Dr. Helen Bancroft. They remember the recording. They remember the voice that spoke from the fog, the voice that said, "Thank you," as if something had finally been given what it had been seeking for a very long time. And they wonder sometimes if the footsteps are still looking, or if they have found what they need, and are simply waiting for the next one. The disappearance of Dr. Helen Bancroft remains officially classified as accidental death, body not recovered. The Knox County Sheriff's file was closed in 2003. The audio recording has never been publicly released. Partial transcripts exist, but have not been authenticated. Monhegan Island remains inhabited. The year-round population is currently 63. The footsteps have been reported as recently as 2019. No one has followed them since. Numbers do not lie, but sometimes they refuse to tell the whole truth. Beals Island lies at the easternmost edge of Maine, a small fishing community connected to the mainland by a narrow bridge that spans the tidal channel, separating it from Jonesport. The island is approximately 3 miles long and less than a mile wide, its shoreline a jagged maze of granite ledges, tidal flats, and working wharves where lobster boats rest between hauls. The people of Beals Island have never been particularly interested in the outside world. They fish. They raise families. They attend the small Baptist church that has stood on the island's highest point since 1872. They bury their dead in the cemetery behind the church, where the oldest stones date to the 1700s, and the names repeat generation after generation. Alley, Beal, Carver, Kelly, the same families, the same bloodlines, the same quiet persistence against the sea. The island has no hotel, no restaurant, no tourist attractions. Visitors are rare and generally unwelcome. The bridge brought the world closer, but the islanders have never seen that as a blessing. In 1990, the United States conducted its 21st decennial census. Enumerators fanned out across the country, counting every man, woman, and child in every city, town, and village. The process was methodical, bureaucratic, and presumed to be accurate. On Beals Island, the count came to 597. The islanders knew immediately that the number was wrong. The discrepancy was first noticed by Reverend Harold Carver, pastor of the Beals Island Baptist Church, who maintained meticulous records of his congregation. In preparation for the church's annual report, he cross-referenced his membership rolls with the census data that had been published in the Machias Valley News Observer that autumn. The census listed 597 residents. Reverend Carver's church records showed 601. He assumed initially that the error was his own. He recounted. He checked births, deaths, arrivals, and departures. He consulted with the town clerk, a woman named Doris Alley, who maintained separate records of property ownership, voter registration, and school enrollment. Doris's numbers matched his, 601. "I've been clerk for 23 years," Doris would later tell a researcher. "I know every person on this island. I know their parents and their grandparents. I know who was born here and who married in. 597 is not the right number. It's 4 people short." The question then was obvious. Which 4 people had the census missed? It took Doris less than a week to find the answer. The missing names were Vernon Kelly, age 44, Raymond Beal, age 38, Scott Alley, age 29, and Dennis Carver, age 23, Reverend Carver's own nephew. All 4 were lifelong residents of Beals Island. All 4 were lobstermen. All 4 appeared in church baptismal records, school enrollment files, and property tax assessments going back years, in some cases, decades. None of them appeared in the 1990 census. Doris Alley contacted the Census Bureau's regional office in Boston. She explained the discrepancy and provided documentation: church records, school records, tax records, voter registration forms. She requested a correction. The response, which arrived 6 weeks later, was brief and unsatisfying. The Bureau had reviewed its enumeration records and found no evidence that the 4 individuals in question had been counted. However, the Bureau also noted that it had no record of any enumerator visiting the addresses associated with those individuals. This was, in itself, unusual. Census procedure required enumerators to visit every dwelling, occupied or not, and to document each visit. If a household did not respond, follow-up visits were mandatory. The absence of any record suggested either a significant procedural failure or something else entirely. Doris pressed for clarification. The Bureau did not respond. In February of 1991, she drove to Boston and presented herself at the regional office in person. She brought copies of every document she had, along with signed affidavits from 12 island residents confirming the existence and residency of the 4 missing men. The official who met with her, a mid-level administrator named Gerald Whitfield, was polite but unhelpful. He reviewed her materials, made copies, and assured her that the matter would be investigated. "He looked at me like I was crazy," Doris later recalled, "like I was trying to invent people out of thin air. But I had the paperwork. I had the proof. Those men existed. They lived here. They paid taxes. They went to church. They had families. She paused. They just weren't in the count. The investigation Doris had been promised never materialized. Her follow-up letters went unanswered. Her phone calls were not returned. By the summer of 1991, she had given up on the Census Bureau entirely, but she had not given up on understanding what had happened. Working with Reverend Carver and several other longtime residents, Doris began reconstructing the final weeks of the 4 missing men's lives. What she found only deepened the mystery. Vernon Kelly, Raymond Beal, Scott Alley, and Dennis Carver had all departed Beals Island on the morning of April 3, 1990. This was 3 weeks before the census enumeration began, but also 3 weeks before any of them were last seen alive. The 4 men had been heading to check lobster traps in the waters south of Great Wass Island. The weather that morning was clear but deteriorating. A fog advisory had been issued for the afternoon, and most fishermen had decided to stay in port. Vernon, Raymond, Scott, and Dennis had gone out anyway. They were last seen at approximately 6:15 a.m., motoring past the breakwater in 2 boats, Vernon and Raymond in Vernon's vessel, the 3 Sisters, and Scott and Dennis in Scott's smaller boat, the Eliza Dawn. A fisherman named Lloyd Beal, Raymond's cousin, watched them disappear into the early morning haze. "I told them the fog was coming," Lloyd said in a 1992 interview. "Vernon just waved me off, said they'd be back before it got bad." They were not. The fog arrived earlier than forecast, rolling in from the southeast at approximately 8:30 a.m. Visibility dropped to near zero. By noon, when the 4 men had not returned, their families began to worry. The Coast Guard was contacted at 1:15 p.m. A search was launched, hampered by the fog, which did not lift until the following morning. Aircraft and surface vessels covered hundreds of square miles over the next 4 days. Neither boat was ever found. No wreckage, no debris, no life jackets, no bodies, nothing. The disappearance was logged as a presumed double maritime accident. Both vessels were assumed to have sunk, though no cause could be determined. The 4 men were declared dead in absentia in 1991. Their names were inscribed on the memorial wall at the Beals Island Baptist Church, alongside generations of fishermen who had been taken by the sea, but their names were not in the census. The timeline is what troubles the islanders most. The men disappeared on April 3rd. The census enumeration for Beals Island took place between April 22nd and April 28th. By the time the enumerators arrived, Vernon, Raymond, Scott, and Dennis had been missing for nearly 3 weeks, but they had not yet been declared dead. The search was still technically active. Their families had not yet filed the paperwork required to have them legally removed from residency rolls. Under census procedures, they should have been counted. Missing persons are counted at their last known address until they are legally declared dead, or their residency status changes. The 4 men qualified on every criterion, and yet they were not counted. Doris Alley obtained a copy of the enumeration worksheets for Beals Island through a Freedom of Information request filed in 1993. The documents, heavily redacted, showed that enumerators had visited every occupied dwelling on the island, except 4. The addresses skipped were the homes of Vernon Kelly, Raymond Beal, Scott Alley, and Dennis Carver. No explanation was provided. No follow-up visits were documented. The enumerators had simply not gone to those houses, as if the houses did not exist, or as if the men who lived there had already been erased. Doris sent a letter to the Census Bureau requesting an explanation. The response, which arrived 4 months later, stated only that the enumeration of Beals Island, Maine, was conducted in accordance with established procedures and that no errors have been identified in the official count. She wrote back, asking how 4 addresses could be skipped without being logged as non-responses. She never received an answer. In 2000, the next decennial census was conducted. Doris Alley, now 71, made a point of being present when the enumerator arrived at her home. The young woman who knocked on her door was polite and efficient. She asked the standard questions, recorded the answers, and thanked Doris for her time. Before she left, Doris asked her a question. "Do you have a list of addresses to visit?" The enumerator nodded. "Every address on the island?" "That's the idea." Doris gave her the addresses of the 4 missing men, the homes that had been skipped in 1990. The enumerator checked her list. "These aren't on here," she said. "Why not?" The enumerator shrugged. "I just go where the list tells me. I don't make the list." Doris asked who did make the list. The enumerator didn't know. The 4 houses still stand on Beals Island. Vernon Kelly's home was sold to his sister in 1992. Raymond Beals was inherited by his son. Scott Alley's was purchased by an off-islander in 1998 and is used as a summer cottage. Dennis Carver's remains in the Carver family, occupied now by a distant cousin. People live in them. People pay taxes on them. People receive mail there. But according to the Census Bureau, the addresses do not exist. A researcher from the University of Southern Maine attempted to investigate the discrepancy in 2008. She filed records requests, interviewed islanders, and submitted a formal inquiry to the Census Bureau's Historical Division. Her request was denied. The reason given was that enumeration records from the 1990 census for the specified geographic area are not available for public review. She asked why. "Administrative purposes," was the only response. Reverend Harold Carver died in 2004. Doris Alley died in 2011. Most of the people who remember Vernon, Raymond, Scott, and Dennis firsthand are gone now, or nearly so. But the church records remain, the school enrollment files remain, the tax assessments and voter registrations remain. 4 men lived on Beals Island. 4 men went out into the fog on an April morning and never came back, and 4 men were never counted. The Census Bureau has never acknowledged the discrepancy. The 1990 count for Beals Island remains officially 597. The island's current population, according to the 2020 census, is 489. The memorial wall at the Baptist Church still bears their names: Vernon Kelly, Raymond Beal, Scott Alley, Dennis Carver. Beneath the names, a single line: "Lost at sea, April 3rd, 1990. But lost, the islanders say, is not the same as erased. Lost means the sea took them. Erased means something else decided they were never there. And the census, that careful, methodical, bureaucratic count of every American soul, says they never were." There is a story the old-timers tell, though they do not tell it often. They say that on certain foggy mornings, if you stand at the breakwater where Lloyd Beale once watched the 3 sisters and the Eliza Dawn motor out to sea, you can hear engines in the distance. Not the engines of boats returning, the engines of boats departing, heading out into the fog, over and over, forever. 4 men who were never counted. 4 men the numbers say did not exist. 4 men still looking for a way to come home. The 1990 census count for Beals Island, Maine, remains officially 597. No correction has ever been issued. The disappearance of Vernon Kelly, Raymond Beal, Scott Alley, and Dennis Carver was classified as presumed death by maritime accident. No bodies or wreckage were ever recovered. The Census Bureau has declined all requests for comment or clarification. The islanders have stopped asking, but they have not stopped counting. A lighthouse keeper's job is to stay, no matter what comes out of the dark, no matter what the sea sends howling against the rocks. The keeper stays. Harold Sims understood this better than most. He stayed for 19 years, and then, one night, something else arrived, and Harold was the one who left. Petite Manon Light stands on a barren granite island approximately 3 miles off the coast of Millbridge, Maine. The island is small, barely 7 acres of rock, scrub grass, and nesting seabirds, and the lighthouse that rises from its center is one of the tallest in the state, its white granite tower climbing 119 feet above the water. On clear nights, the light can be seen for 19 miles. The station was established in 1817 to mark the entrance to Narraguagus Bay, a treacherous stretch of water littered with submerged ledges and tidal currents that had claimed dozens of vessels in the centuries before the light was built. For more than 150 years, keepers lived on the island in near total isolation, maintaining the light, tending the fog signal, and recording the weather in logbooks that would eventually fill entire shelves at the National Archives. It was not a job for everyone. The island offered no shelter from winter storms, no escape from summer's relentless seabird colonies, no company except the occasional supply boat, and the endless conversation of wind and wave. Keepers who lasted more than a few years were rare. Keepers who lasted decades were rarer still. Harold Sims lasted 19 years. He arrived at Petit Manan in 1949, a 31-year-old Navy veteran who had spent the war maintaining navigation equipment on destroyers in the Pacific. He was quiet, methodical, and comfortable with solitude. The lighthouse service, and later the Coast Guard, which absorbed it in 1939, considered him an ideal candidate for isolated duty. Harold never married. He had no children. His only family was a sister in Bangor, whom he visited twice a year during his annual leave. The rest of his life was the light. The logbooks Harold kept during his tenure at Petit Manan are preserved at the National Archives facility in Waltham, Massachusetts. They span nearly 2 decades and fill 11 volumes, each one a meticulous record of weather conditions, equipment maintenance, supply deliveries, and the small observations that marked the passage of time on an island where nothing ever seemed to change. Wind northwest 15 knots, visibility unlimited, clean lens, repaired shutter mechanism. Fog signal operated 0300 to 0715, consumed 12 gallons fuel. Supply boat arrived 10:30, received provisions, mail, replacement mantles for lamp. The entries are repetitive, almost hypnotic in their regularity. Harold recorded the same information in the same format, day after day, year after year. The handwriting is neat and consistent, the observations precise. Reading them, one gets the sense of a man who found comfort in routine, who measured his life in the small certainties of duty fulfilled. The final volume covers the period from January 1967 to October 1968. The entries from that final year begin normally indistinguishable from those that came before. Then, in the summer of 1968, something changes. The first anomalous entry is dated July 14, 1968. Fog signal bell removed for repairs 0800. Contractor boat arrived from Rockland. Bell to be recast. Crack in crown identified during inspection. Expected return 3 to 4 weeks. This was routine. The fog bell at Petit Manan was an essential backup to the steam-powered fog signal used when the primary system was down for maintenance. Bells were removed periodically for inspection and repair. There was nothing unusual about the work order, but Harold's subsequent entries suggest the bell's absence affected him more than it should have. July 16th. Station quiet without bell. Notice its absence more than expected. Wind calm, no need for fog signal, but silence feels incomplete. July 21st. Woke at 0300 thinking I heard bell. Went to tower. No bell, obviously. Fog light but persistent. Returned to quarters. July 28th. Heard bell again. 0215. Clear tone, single strike. Went to tower, checked equipment. No malfunction. No bell. Logged as possible auditory anomaly. Fatigue? The entries continue in this vein through early August. Harold reports hearing the bell repeatedly, always at night, always a single strike, always when he is alone in his quarters. He attributes the sounds to fatigue, to the wind, to the echoes of waves against the granite foundation. He does not seem alarmed. He seems, if anything, mildly annoyed at himself for being distracted by phantom sounds. Then, on August 19th, the tone shifts. Fog arrived 1830, dense, unusual. Light barely penetrates 50 feet, signal operating continuously. Heard bell again at 2,200, 3 strikes this time. Went to tower, thought I saw someone on the catwalk. No one there, no one could be there, must rest. The fog that arrived on August 19, 1968, did not lift for 11 days. Weather records from the period confirm an unusual atmospheric pattern that settled over the eastern Maine coast in late August. A stalled low-pressure system, combined with warm ocean currents and cool continental air, created conditions for persistent dense fog that blanketed the region from Scudic Point to Machias Bay. At Petit Manan, the fog was particularly severe. Harold's logbook entries describe visibility dropping to less than 20 feet at times, so thick that he could not see the water from the base of the tower. The fog signal ran continuously, consuming fuel at twice the normal rate. Supply boats could not reach the island. Harold was alone, as he had been for 19 years, but this time the isolation felt different. August 22nd. Fog unchanged, light useless, cannot penetrate more than 30 feet. Heard footsteps on tower stairs at 0130, checked thoroughly, no one. Checked again at 0300 after hearing same, no one. Beginning to doubt my own perceptions. August 25th, bell again, continuous now, ringing every few minutes. I know it is not there, I know it was removed, but I hear it. The sound is inside the station, inside the walls, cannot locate source. August 27th. Saw a figure on catwalk at dawn, stood at railing looking out at fog, went to investigate, found no one, returned to quarters, saw figure again from window, same position, same posture, did not investigate second time. August 29th. Fog is inside now. The entry for August 29th, 1968 is the last complete entry in Harold Sims's logbook. It is also the longest. The handwriting begins normally but deteriorates as the entry progresses, becoming cramped, uneven, and difficult to read. Certain words are written over multiple times as if Harold was struggling to make them legible or struggling to convince himself they were real. The full text reads, August 29th, 1968, 0400 hours, fog unchanged, cannot see beyond windows, cannot see tower from quarters, light operating but invisible from ground level, confirmed by failed visual check at 0230, heard bell at 0315. Continuous ringing, went to source, source is everywhere, source is nowhere, bell is not here, but I hear it. I hear it in the walls, I hear it in the stairs, I hear it in my chest. Footsteps on stairs at 0345, heavy, slow, counted them, 119 steps. That is the exact number of stairs in the tower. Someone climbed to the top, went to check. No one at top, no one on stairs. Came back down, heard footsteps again, same count, 119. Fog is inside now. I can see it in the corners of the room. I can see it under the door. It does not move like fog should. It waits. It watches. I can hear the bell, but the bell is gone. The bell has been gone for 6 weeks. But I hear it. Someone is climbing the stairs. I think it's me. I think it has always been me. The entry ends there. The remaining pages of the logbook are blank. Harold Sims was reported missing on September 2, 1968, when a supply boat finally reached Petit Manan after the fog lifted. The crew found the station in perfect order, light functioning, fog signal secure, provisions properly stored. Harold's personal effects were in his quarters. His coat hung on its hook. His boots stood by the door. Harold was not there. A search was conducted over the following week. The island was small. There were few places a man could go. Divers searched the waters around the rocks. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the surrounding sea. Nothing was found. The Coast Guard investigation concluded that Harold had likely fallen from the tower or the rocks during the fog and been swept away by the tide. The case was classified as accidental death, body not recovered. But the investigators noted several details that did not fit the official explanation. Harold's logbook was found closed on his desk, as if he had finished writing and put it away deliberately. His pen was capped and placed beside it. His reading glasses were folded on top of a novel he had been reading, a collection of maritime ghost stories, ironically, that his sister had sent him for his birthday. The tower door was locked from the inside. The windows of his quarters were latched. There was no indication that Harold had gone outside, no muddy footprints, no wet clothing, no sign that he had ventured into the fog at all. And then there was the bell. The fog bell that had been removed for repairs was returned to Petit Manan on September 15, 1968, 2 weeks after Harold's disappearance. The contractor who delivered it, a metal worker from Rockland named Eugene Sprague, later provided a statement to Coast Guard investigators. "I didn't know the keeper was missing until I got there," Eugene said. "The Coast Guard boys who met me didn't say much about it. They just wanted me to install the bell and leave." Eugene completed the installation without incident, but as he was packing up his tools, he noticed something that troubled him. "The bell wasn't right," he said. "I mean, it was the same bell, same serial number, same casting marks. But when I struck it to test the tone, it didn't sound the way it should. It was flat, dull, like something was dampening it from inside." He reported the issue to the Coast Guard, who inspected the bell and found nothing wrong. The tone, they said, was within acceptable parameters. Eugene disagreed. "I've been working with bells for 30 years, he said. "I know what they're supposed to sound like. That bell sounded wrong. It sounded like it had already been rung too many times. Like it was tired," he paused, "or like it was still ringing somewhere, and we just couldn't hear it." Petit Manan Light was automated in 1972, 4 years after Harold's disappearance. The keeper's quarters were demolished. The fog bell was replaced with an electronic signal. The tower itself remains, maintained now by remote monitoring and occasional visits from Coast Guard technicians. The island is part of the Petit Manan National Wildlife Refuge, closed to the public to protect nesting seabird populations. Researchers who visit the island for biological surveys rarely stay overnight. Those who do report nothing unusual, no sounds, no figures, no fog that behaves strangely. But the fishermen who work the waters around Petit Manan tell different stories. They say that on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the light struggles to penetrate, you can hear a bell ringing from the island. A single tone, then another, then another. 119 strikes, if you count them. One for each step of the tower stairs. And then silence. Harold Sims's logbook was transferred to the National Archives in 1974. It remained uncatalogued for more than a decade, eventually filed among thousands of similar documents from decommissioned lighthouse stations across the country. A researcher discovered it in 1988 while compiling a history of Maine lighthouses. She requested permission to quote from the final entry in her book. The request was denied without explanation. The logbook was reclassified in 1992. Its current status is restricted access, administrative review required. No explanation for the restriction has been provided. Harold's sister, Marguerite Sims Thornton, died in 1981. In her personal papers, her family found a letter Harold had written but never sent, dated August 17, 1968, 2 days before the fog arrived. The letter was brief and unremarkable, mostly news about the weather and the seabirds and the slow passage of summer days. But the final paragraph stood out. "I have been thinking lately about what it means to keep a light," Harold wrote. "We say we are keeping the light burning, keeping the ship safe, keeping watch over the sea. But I wonder sometimes if we have it backwards. I wonder if the light is keeping us, holding us here, waiting for something we cannot see. He signed it, as he always did, "Your brother, Harold." He never sent it. The fog came 2 days later, and Harold Sims, who had stayed for 19 years, finally left. The disappearance of Harold Sims remains officially classified as accidental death, body not recovered. The Coast Guard file was closed in 1969 and has not been reopened. Petit Manan Light continues to operate as an automated navigational aid. The original fog bell was removed in 1972 and is believed to have been scrapped. Harold's logbook remains in restricted archives. The final entry has never been officially released. The fishermen still hear the bell sometimes on foggy nights. 119 strikes, and then silence, and then, if they listen very carefully, the sound of footsteps, climbing, always climbing. The dead do not return, but sometimes what they leave behind finds its way back. Friendship is a small harbor town on the western shore of Muscongas Bay, a community of fewer than 1,200 people whose families have worked these waters for generations. The town is known, to the extent it is known at all, for the Friendship sloop, a traditional gaff-rigged sailboat design that originated here in the late 19th century and is still built by a handful of local craftsmen who learned the trade from their fathers and grandfathers. The harbor is modest, protected from the open Atlantic by a series of islands that break the worst of the winter storms. Lobster boats line the wharves, their colors faded by salt and sun. The village itself consists of a general store, a small library, a white church with a steeple that has been repaired so many times that none of the original wood remains, and rows of weathered clapboard houses that lean slightly toward the sea as if listening for something. The people of Friendship do not speak easily to outsiders. They are not unfriendly exactly, but they are private in the way that all coastal Maine communities are private, aware that the sea takes more than it gives, and that grief, once spoken aloud, has a way of lingering. They do not speak often of the Annabelle, but they remember. The Annabelle was a 34-foot wooden lobster boat built in 1963 at a boatyard in Thomaston. She was named for the mother of her first owner, a Friendship fisherman named Clarence Watton, who sold her in 1971 to a younger man named Robert Theriot. Robert was 32 years old in 1978, a native of Friendship who had fished these waters since he was old enough to haul a trap. He had purchased the Annabelle with savings from 7 years of deckhand work, and he had spent another 2 years restoring her, replacing rotted planking, rebuilding the engine, refinishing the wheelhouse until the wood gleamed like honey in the afternoon light. The Annabelle was more than a boat to Robert. She was proof that a man could build something with his hands and his labor, something that would last, something that would carry him and his family into a future he could finally see clearly. He crewed the boat with 2 men, his younger brother, Paul Theriot, age 28, and a childhood friend named William Ozier, age 34. The 3 had grown up together, fished together, survived the lean years together. They trusted each other the way men trust each other when their lives depend on it. On the morning of November 9, 1978, the Annabelle departed Friendship Harbor at approximately 4:30 a.m. The weather forecast called for building seas and possible gale conditions by late afternoon. But the morning was calm enough, and the 3 men planned to check their outer traps and return before the weather deteriorated. They did not return. The storm arrived faster than predicted. By noon, winds had exceeded 40 knots, and seas in Muscongas Bay were running 8 to 10 feet. The Annabelle was last heard from at approximately 11:15 a.m., when Robert radioed the harbormaster to report that they were heading in, running ahead of the weather. That was the final transmission. The Coast Guard launched a search at 2:30 p.m. after the Annabelle failed to appear and could not be raised by radio. Conditions made the search difficult. Visibility was poor, seas were dangerous, and daylight was fading. The search continued through the night and into the following day, expanding to cover more than 200 square miles of open water. On November 11th, debris was spotted approximately 6 miles southeast of Friendship. A life ring bearing the name Annabelle was recovered, along with fragments of wooden hull planking and a section of the vessel's stern rail. The debris pattern suggested the boat had broken apart in heavy seas, likely after being rolled by a wave. No bodies were recovered. The official finding was that the Annabelle had sunk in the storm, with all hands lost. Robert Theriot, Paul Theriot, and William Osier were declared dead. A memorial service was held at the Friendship Church on November 19th. The pews were full. The entire town attended. Robert's widow, a woman named Catherine, sat in the front row with their 2 children, a daughter, age 7, and a son, age 4. She did not cry during the service. She had cried enough in the days before, privately, when no one could see. Now she simply sat, holding her children's hands, staring at the 3 photographs displayed on easels at the front of the church. 3 men, 3 smiles. 3 lives ended in an instant by a sea that offered no explanations and asked no forgiveness. Catherine Theriot never remarried. She raised her children in the same house where she and Robert had built their life together, a small Cape Cod on a hill overlooking the harbor. She worked at the general store for 23 years, then retired to care for her aging mother. She rarely spoke of Robert, but she kept a photograph of the Annabelle's crew on her bedroom dresser, the 3 men standing on the dock, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera on a summer afternoon that seemed, in memory, to have lasted forever. Catherine died in February of 1983, 5 years after the sinking. She was 41 years old. The cause was pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late for treatment. Her children, by then teenagers, were taken in by her sister in Rockland. At Catherine's request, she was buried in the Friendship Cemetery beside a marker that had been placed for Robert, though his body was never recovered. And at her request, the photograph of the Annabelle's crew, the same one that had sat on her dresser for 5 years, was placed in her casket and buried with her. She wanted to take them with her, her sister Miriam would later explain. She said she'd waited long enough. She said it was time to bring them home. The photograph was described in the funeral home's records. 3 men on a dock, summer light, the stern of the Annabelle visible in the background. A 4x6 print, color, slightly faded, with a crease in the upper left corner where it had been folded once and then carefully smoothed. That photograph was buried with Catherine Theriot on February 22, 1983. 28 years later, it was found on the Friendship dock. The fog arrived on the evening of October 14, 2011. It came in fast, as autumn fog often does along the Maine coast, rolling across Muscongas Bay and settling over Friendship Harbor like a held breath. By 8 p.m., visibility had dropped to less than 30 feet. By 9, the harbor had disappeared entirely, replaced by a white stillness that muffled sound and erased the line between water and sky. The first witness was Martha Cushman, a 67-year-old widow who lived in a cottage overlooking the harbor. She was washing dishes at her kitchen sink at approximately 9:20 p.m. when she noticed a light moving through the fog. It was just a glow at first, Martha would later tell investigators, like a flashlight maybe, or a lantern. But it was moving across the water, not along the shore, and it was coming closer. She watched as the light resolved into the shape of a boat, a small lobster boat, wooden-hulled, with a low cabin and a single mast. The vessel was drifting slowly toward the inner harbor, toward the old town wharf that had served Friendship's fishing fleet for more than a century. Martha could not see anyone aboard. She picked up her phone and called her neighbor, a man named Dwight Simmons, who lived 3 houses down and had a clearer view of the wharf. Dwight confirmed what Martha had seen. "There's a boat coming in," he said. "I don't recognize her. She's not running lights, just that one lantern on the bow. I can't see who's at the helm." Dwight put on his jacket and walked down to the harbor. By the time he reached the wharf, the boat was gone. The third witness was the harbor master, a 54-year-old man named Kenneth Collimore. Kenneth had been in his office at the harbor station, reviewing mooring permits, when Dwight Simmons called to report the unidentified vessel. Kenneth walked out onto the main wharf with a flashlight. The fog was impenetrable, thick enough that he could barely see the pilings beneath his feet. He called out, asking if anyone was there. No one answered. He walked the length of the wharf, checking each mooring, each slip, each post. All the boats he expected to see were there, secured against the fog. There was no unfamiliar vessel, no lantern, no sign that anything had arrived. But when Kenneth reached the old mooring post at the end of the wharf, a post that had not been used in years, its iron ring rusted, and its timbers gray with age, he stopped. The rope was fresh. Someone had tied a line to the post recently, within the hour. The fibers were new, the knot tight, and the iron ring bore fresh rope burns where a vessel had pulled against its mooring. And lying on the boards beside the post, as if someone had placed it there deliberately, was a photograph. Kenneth picked it up. It was waterlogged, the colors faded, the paper soft and beginning to separate. But the image was still visible. 3 men on a dock, summer light. A boat's stern in the background, the name Annabelle clearly visible in white paint. Kenneth knew those men. He had grown up hearing their names. He had seen their photographs in the church, on the memorial wall, in the homes of their relatives. Robert Theriot, Paul Theriot, William Ozier, the crew of the Annabelle. And in the upper left corner of the photograph, just as the funeral home records had described, there was a crease, a fold that had been carefully smoothed but never fully erased. The Friendship Police were contacted that night. They examined the photograph, the rope burns, the mooring post. They interviewed Martha Cushman, Dwight Simmons, and Kenneth Collimore. All 3 witnesses maintained their accounts. All 3 were considered credible. The photograph was sent to the State Crime Lab in Augusta for analysis. The results, which arrived 3 weeks later, raised more questions than they answered. The paper was consistent with photographic stock manufactured in the mid-1970s. The developing chemicals were consistent with processing methods common during that era. The water damage was extensive, but appeared recent, within the past 24 to 48 hours. Most significantly, the photograph showed signs of advanced deterioration consistent with prolonged burial in soil. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of calcium and iron compounds typical of cemetery earth. The photograph had been underground for a long time, and now it was on the dock. The funeral home that had handled Catherine Theriot's burial had closed in 1994. Its records had been transferred to a successor firm in Rockland, which confirmed that a photograph matching the description had been placed in Catherine's casket at her request. There was, of course, a logical explanation. Someone could have exhumed the photograph. Someone could have opened the casket, removed the image, and placed it on the dock as a prank or a hoax. But there was no evidence of disturbance at Catherine's grave. A quiet investigation conducted by the cemetery's caretaker found the plot undisturbed, the earth settled, the grass unbroken. No one had dug there, not recently, not ever. The photograph had come from somewhere, but not, apparently, from the ground. The sighting of the vessel was never explained. No boat matching the Annabelle's description was registered in Maine or any neighboring state. No one reported a missing vessel. No debris was found, no fuel slick, no indication that any boat had entered or departed Friendship Harbor that night. But the rope burns remained. Fresh rope on an old post, a vessel had been there, and the photograph remained. three men, smiling, on a summer afternoon that ended 33 years ago. Kenneth Collymore kept the photograph in his desk drawer for several months. He did not know what to do with it. Returning it to the family seemed wrong. How would he explain where it came from? Destroying it seemed worse. Eventually, he donated it to the Friendship Historical Society, where it was placed in an archival folder and filed under Miscellaneous Maritime Artifacts. The curator who cataloged the photograph noted one additional detail that had escaped the police investigation. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that had been partially obscured by water damage, someone had written a message. Most of the words were illegible, lost to moisture and decay, but two words were still readable. Finally home. The people of Friendship do not speak of the night the Annabelle came home. They do not discuss the photograph, or the rope burns, or the vessel that three witnesses saw and no one can explain. But they remember Catherine Theriot, who waited 5 years for a boat that would never return and who asked to be buried with the only proof that her husband and his crew had ever existed. And they remember what her sister said at the funeral. She said she'd waited long enough. She said it was time to bring them home. Perhaps, the old-timers say, she finally did. Perhaps on that fog-shrouded night in 2011, something heard her. Something answered. Perhaps the Annabelle, lost for 33 years in whatever place lost boats go, finally found its way back to the harbor where it belonged. And perhaps it came not to stay, but to deliver a message, to leave a photograph on a dock where someone would find it, to let the living know that the dead had not forgotten, that they were at last home. The sighting of the unidentified vessel in Friendship Harbor on October 14, 2011, remains unexplained. No official investigation was conducted beyond the initial police inquiry. The photograph is currently held by the Friendship Historical Society. Its provenance has never been determined. The grave of Catherine Theriot remains undisturbed in the Friendship Cemetery. The marker beside it still bears her husband's name, though his body was never recovered. The Annabelle has not been seen since, but the old mooring post at the end of the town wharf still stands. And sometimes, on foggy autumn nights, the harbor master walks out to check it, just in case someone is trying to come home. Children wave at boats. It is one of the small, unchanging truths of coastal life. They stand on docks and breakwaters and rocky points, and they wave at the fishermen heading out and coming home, and the fishermen wave back. It has always been this way, except once. Port Clyde sits at the southern tip of the St. George Peninsula, a fishing village of perhaps 300 year-round residents whose families have worked these waters for generations. The harbor is small and well protected, nestled between granite headlands that shield it from the worst of the Atlantic swells. Lobster boats crowd the moorings. The air smells of bait and diesel and salt. At the eastern edge of the harbor stands Marshall Point, a narrow finger of rock that extends into the mouth of the bay. The lighthouse there has guided mariners since 1857, a modest white tower connected to the keeper's house by a wooden walkway that has become one of the most photographed spots on the Maine coast. Tourists come in summer to stand where Forrest Gump stood in the movie to take pictures of the walkway and the light and the endless gray-blue sea beyond. But the locals know Marshall Point differently. They know it as the place where the land ends and something else begins. They know the currents that swirl around its base, the fog that gathers there before spreading across the harbor, the strange acoustics that make sounds carry in unexpected ways. And after the summer of 1995, they know it as the place where the children stood. The morning of July 17, 1995, began clear and warm. The lobster fleet departed Port Clyde before dawn, spreading across the fishing grounds that extended south toward Monhegan Island and east into Muscongas Bay. By mid-morning, most boats had begun working their way back toward the harbor, their holds heavy with the day's catch. The fog arrived at approximately 11:15 a.m. It came from the southeast, rolling across the water in a dense white wall that swallowed the outer islands within minutes. Fishermen who saw it coming described it as unusually thick, unusually fast, and unusually localized, concentrated in the approaches to Port Clyde while the surrounding waters remained relatively clear. By 11:30, visibility in the harbor mouth had dropped to less than 50 feet. The first boat to report the sighting was the Lillian Grace, captained by a 61-year-old fisherman named Alton Pease. Alton was navigating by compass and dead reckoning, running slow, when he emerged from the fog bank approximately 200 yards from Marshall Point. The fog thinned briefly near the shore, and in that moment, Alton saw them. Children, standing on the rocks at the base of the lighthouse, 4 of them, maybe 5, he couldn't be certain. They were motionless, facing the water, watching his boat approach. Alton raised his hand to wave, as he had done thousands of times before to the summer visitors who gathered at Marshall Point to watch the boats come in. The children did not wave back. They did not move at all. They simply stood there, silent and still, their faces turned toward the Lillian Grace as it passed. Alton later described the moment to investigators. "I've been waving at kids on that point since I was a kid myself," he said. "They always wave back, always. But these children, they just watched. It was like they were waiting for something, or looking for someone." He paused. "I couldn't see their faces clearly. The fog was playing tricks. But I had the feeling they could see mine." Within the next 20 minutes, 2 other boats reported similar sightings. The Dorothy May, captained by Raymond Hupper, age 54, passed Marshall Point at approximately 11:40 a.m. Raymond saw what he described as a group of young ones standing on the rocks like statues. He waved. They did not respond. The Sea Breeze, captained by Walter Andrews, age 47, passed the point at approximately 11:50 a.m. Walter saw 4 or 5 children, couldn't tell their ages, just standing there staring. He did not wave. Something, he said, told him not to. All 3 captains noted the same details. The children were motionless. They were silent. They were watching the boats with an intensity that felt, in the words of Raymond Hupper, like being looked at through a window you didn't know was there. None of the captains could describe the children's clothing, their hair color, or their features. The fog made details impossible, but all 3 were certain of what they had seen. Children, on Marshall Point, watching, not waving. By 12:30 p.m., the fog had begun to lift. Within an hour, visibility had returned to normal, and the harbor was bathed in the clear, sharp light of a summer afternoon. A small group of residents, having heard the fishermen's accounts, walked out to Marshall Point to investigate. The lighthouse keeper, a seasonal employee named Diane Fournier, met them at the base of the tower. She had not seen any children. The rocks where the children had reportedly stood were empty. There were no footprints in the mud near the shore, no candy wrappers or soda cans or any of the detritus that children inevitably leave behind. The lighthouse log, which Diane maintained meticulously, recorded no visitors between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. No children had been at Marshall Point that morning, at least none that anyone on land had seen. The fishermen were questioned individually. Their accounts were consistent in every significant detail. They had seen children. The children had not waved. The children had watched them pass with an attention that none of them could explain and none of them could forget. By evening, the incident had become the subject of quiet conversation throughout Port Clyde. Some dismissed it as a trick of the fog, a collective hallucination born of fatigue and poor visibility. Others were less certain. Among those who were less certain was a young man named Thomas Woodward. Thomas was 24 years old, a deckhand on the Sea Breeze who had been aboard when Walter Andrews spotted the children on Marshall Point. He had not seen them himself. He had been below, stowing gear. But he had heard Walter's account, and something about it had lodged in his mind like a splinter. Thomas was not superstitious. He had grown up in Port Clyde, fished these waters since he was 14, and had never given much thought to the old stories that circulated among the older fishermen, tales of ghost ships and drowned sailors and lights that appeared on the water when no boats were present. He considered himself practical, level-headed, immune to the kind of imagination that turned fog and shadow into something more. But that evening, as the sun began to set and the summer light softened over the harbor, Thomas found himself walking toward Marshall Point. He told no one where he was going. His mother, with whom he still lived, assumed he had gone to the Dip Net, the local restaurant where the younger fishermen gathered after work. His crewmates assumed he had gone home. At approximately 8:15 p.m., a woman named Harriet Sewell saw Thomas walking along the harbor road toward the lighthouse. She waved. He did not wave back. He was walking like he was in a hurry, Harriet later told police. Not running, but purposeful, like he had somewhere to be. That was the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Woodward. When Thomas did not return home that night, his mother assumed he had stayed with friends. When he did not appear for work the next morning, the sea breeze departed without him. It was not until late afternoon, when his mother called the harbor office to ask if anyone had seen her son, that concern began to spread. A search was organized. Residents walked the roads and paths around the harbor. Boats checked the coves and inlets where a man might have gone if he had taken a skiff without permission. The lighthouse keeper searched Marshall Point and the surrounding rocks. She found the boots at approximately 6:45 p.m. They were at the water's edge, on a flat granite shelf just below the lighthouse walkway. They were placed neatly side by side, toes pointing toward the sea. They were Thomas Woodward's boots, the same scuffed leather work boots he had worn aboard the Sea Breeze that morning. Nothing else was found. No jacket, no wallet, no note. Just the boots, arranged with a precision that suggested deliberation, as if Thomas had stopped, removed them carefully, and then walked into the water. Divers searched the area the following day. The currents around Marshall Point are strong, and a body could easily be carried out to sea within hours. They found nothing. The Coast Guard expanded the search over the next 3 days, covering the waters from Port Clyde to Monhegan Island and beyond. Aircraft flew grid patterns. Local fishermen kept watch from their boats. Thomas Woodward was never found. The investigation into Thomas's disappearance was brief and inconclusive. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no evidence of accident. There was only the boots, the water, and the absence of a young man who had walked toward Marshall Point and never walked back. The official finding was presumed drowning, circumstances undetermined. The case was closed within 6 weeks. But the people of Port Clyde remembered the other details. They remembered that Thomas had been aboard the Sea Breeze when the children were sighted. They remembered that he had walked toward the point on the same evening as if drawn by something he could not name. They remembered the boots, placed so neatly at the water's edge as if he had prepared himself for a journey he knew he would not return from. And they remembered what Walter Andrews said when he heard about the boots. He went to find them, the children. He went to see for himself. Someone asked Walter what he thought had happened. Walter was quiet for a long time. "I think he found them," he said finally. "I think they were waiting for him, and I think they took him wherever they came from." In the years since 1995, there have been no further sightings of children on Marshall Point. The lighthouse continues to operate, automated now, its beam sweeping across the harbor mouth each night as it has for more than a century and a half. Tourists still come to photograph the walkway. Fishermen still pass the point on their way in and out of the harbor. But some of the older fishermen, those who remember that July morning, who saw the children standing motionless on the rocks, do not wave at Marshall Point anymore. They keep their hands on the wheel, their eyes on the water, and they pass the lighthouse in silence. Not because they are afraid, because they are not certain anyone would wave back. Thomas Woodward's mother, Eleanor, lived in Port Clyde until her death in 2008. She never accepted the official finding of drowning. She never believed her son had taken his own life. In a letter she wrote to her sister shortly before she died, Eleanor described a dream she had experienced repeatedly in the years since Thomas's disappearance. "I see him walking on the rocks," she wrote. "It's foggy, like it was that morning. He's walking toward the lighthouse, and there are children there waiting for him. He reaches them, and they take his hands, and they all walk together into the fog. And just before they disappear, Thomas turns around and waves at me." She paused in her letter, then continued, "In the dream, I wave back. I always wave back. But I don't know if he can see me. I don't know if he knows I'm there." The letter was found among Eleanor's possessions after her death. Her sister kept it for many years before donating it, along with other family papers, to the St. George Historical Society. It remains there in a folder marked Woodward Family Correspondence, available to anyone who asks to see it. Few people ask. Marshall Point stands as it always has, a narrow finger of granite extending into the Atlantic. The lighthouse beam still sweeps the darkness. The walkway still draws tourists who want to stand where a movie character once stood, not knowing what else has stood there, waiting, watching, silent. The children have not been seen again, but on certain foggy mornings, when the boats are coming in and the harbor mouth is thick with white, the older fishermen sometimes glance toward the point. Just a glance, just a moment. They do not expect to see anything, but they remember Thomas Woodward, who went looking and never came back. They remember the boots at the water's edge, and they remember the children who would not wave, who only watched, who waited for something that no one else could see. Perhaps they are still waiting. Perhaps they will always be waiting. And perhaps, on some fog-shrouded morning yet to come, they will find what they are looking for. The disappearance of Thomas Woodward remains officially classified as presumed drowning, circumstances undetermined. The Knox County Sheriff's file was closed in 1995 and has not been reopened. No further sightings of children at Marshall Point have been reported. The boots were returned to Eleanor Woodward and are believed to have been buried with her in 2008. Marshall Point Light continues to operate as an automated navigational aid. The Lighthouse Museum is open to visitors from May through October. The fishermen of Port Clyde still pass the point each day. They do not wave. They have learned better. Fog does not move backward. This is one of the small certainties of meteorology, a truth so fundamental that it is rarely stated aloud. Fog forms, drifts, dissipates. It follows wind and temperature and the patient physics of water vapor. It does not reverse. It does not retreat along the same path it arrived. Except once. Owl's Head is a small peninsula town on the western shore of Penobscot Bay, a community of fewer than 2,000 people spread across a landscape of rocky shores, evergreen forests, and the kind of quiet that settles over coastal Maine in winter, like a held breath. The town takes its name from a pair of granite outcroppings at the southern tip of the peninsula that, from a certain angle, resemble the face of an owl. Two hollow caves for eyes, a jutting brow, the patient stillness of a predator watching from the dark. The lighthouse at Owl's Head has stood since 1825, marking the entrance to Rockland Harbor for nearly 2 centuries. The light sits atop a steep bluff, accessible by a wooden staircase that climbs more than 100 feet from the shore below. In summer, tourists hike to the top to photograph the view. In winter, the point is largely deserted, visited only by the occasional local walking a dog or watching the storms roll in from the open Atlantic. The people who live here year-round are accustomed to fog. It is a constant companion, arriving without warning, transforming familiar landscapes into something strange and temporary. They have learned to navigate by sound and instinct when visibility fails. They have learned to wait. But on the morning of February 14th, 2008, the fog did something that none of them could explain. The first witness was Gerald Emery, a 73-year-old retired merchant marine who lived in a small cottage overlooking the mouth of Rockland Harbor. Gerald woke before dawn, as he always did, and walked to his kitchen window to check the weather. The fog was already there. This was not unusual. February in Maine is a month of temperature inversions and ocean moisture, conditions that breed fog as reliably as summer breeds tourists. What was unusual was the fog's position. It was approximately half a mile offshore, sitting on the water in a dense white wall that extended from north to south as far as Gerald could see. The shoreline was clear. The lighthouse beam swept through empty air. The fog simply hung there, motionless, like a curtain drawn across the horizon. Gerald made his coffee and continued to watch. At approximately 6:20 a.m., the fog began to move. It came toward shore, rolling across the water with a speed that Gerald found unsettling. Within 3 minutes, it had reached the rocks at the base of the lighthouse bluff. Within 5 minutes, it had climbed the shore and begun to spread across the land, swallowing the lighthouse, the parking area, and the trees that lined the coastal road. Then it stopped, and then it reversed. Gerald watched, coffee forgotten in his hand, as the fog retreated. Not dissipated, retreated, moving backward along the exact path it had followed, drawing away from the land, descending the bluff, crossing the rocks, and settling once again in its original position half a mile offshore. The entire cycle had taken approximately 18 minutes. Gerald stood at his window, motionless, waiting to see what would happen next. The fog came again. The second advance began at approximately 6:45 a.m. As before, the fog rolled toward shore with unnatural speed, covering the same ground it had covered before: lighthouse, parking area, road, trees. As before, it stopped at a precise line approximately 200 yards inland. This time, there was someone in its path. Her name was Miriam Delano. She was 51 years old, a professor of English literature at the University of Maine, who had taken a sabbatical to finish a book she had been writing for 3 years. She lived alone in a rented cottage near the lighthouse, and she walked her dog, a 6-year-old border collie named Piper, along the shore each morning, regardless of weather. Miriam had left her cottage at approximately 6:30 a.m., unaware of the fog's unusual behavior. By the time she reached the coastal path that wound along the base of the lighthouse bluff, the fog had already completed its first cycle and was beginning its second advance. Several witnesses later reported seeing her. Gerald Emery, still watching from his window, saw a figure on the shoreline path, a woman in a dark coat, a dog trotting beside her. She was walking north toward the lighthouse, moving at a leisurely pace. Another witness, a man named Paul Gagnon, who was driving along the coastal road, saw Miriam from his car. She was approximately 50 yards from the road, walking toward the water's edge. The fog was behind her, advancing. Paul slowed his car, watching. The fog overtook Miriam within seconds. One moment she was there, a clear figure against the gray morning. The next moment she was gone, swallowed by the white. Paul waited. The fog continued to advance for another minute, then stopped. Then it reversed. As before, the fog retreated along its original path, drawing back toward the sea, exposing the land it had covered. The lighthouse emerged. The parking area emerged. The trees emerged. Miriam Delano did not emerge. Paul Gagnon pulled his car to the side of the road and got out. He walked to the spot where he had last seen Miriam, calling her name. There was no response. What he found instead was Piper. The dog was sitting at the edge of the path, approximately 20 feet from the waterline, facing the ocean. She was motionless, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the fog that now hung half a mile offshore. She did not respond when Paul called to her. She did not wag her tail or turn her head. She simply sat there, as if waiting for someone to return. Paul approached the dog slowly. Piper did not move. She did not growl or shy away. She simply continued to stare at the fog. Then Paul noticed the footprints. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight, not deep, perhaps an inch, but enough to hold impressions. Miriam's footprints were clearly visible, leading from the coastal road along the path toward the water. The footprints led to a point approximately 15 feet from where Piper sat, and there they stopped, not turned, not scattered, not overlaid with other prints. Stopped. Paul knelt beside the final footprint, a clear impression of a boot heel in the snow. He looked ahead, toward the water, toward the fog. There were no more prints. There was no sign that Miriam had taken another step. The snow was undisturbed. The ground was untouched. It was as if Miriam Delano had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. The fog came a third time at approximately 7:10 a.m. By then, Paul had called 911, and the first responders were on their way. Gerald Emery had left his cottage and walked toward the lighthouse, compelled by something he could not name. 2 other residents, drawn by the unusual weather, had gathered near the coastal road. They all watched as the fog advanced again, the same path, the same speed, the same inexorable movement from sea to land. It reached the shoreline, it climbed the bluff, it spread across the point. This time, no one walked into it. The witnesses stood at a safe distance, watching the white wall approach and then stop, holding its position at that invisible boundary 200 yards inland. And then, as before, it reversed. The fog retreated. The land emerged. The lighthouse beam, which had been invisible during the advance, swept once more through clear air. The fog settled in its original position, half a mile offshore. It remained there motionless for the rest of the morning. By noon, it had dissipated entirely. Miriam Delano had not reappeared. The search for Miriam lasted 5 days. More than 60 volunteers, along with professional search and rescue teams, covered the peninsula from the lighthouse to the town center. Dogs were brought in. Divers searched the waters below the bluff. Aircraft flew patterns over Penobscot Bay. Nothing was found. The footprints were photographed and analyzed. Investigators confirmed that they matched the boots Miriam had been wearing, a pair of insulated hiking boots purchased from a Rockland outfitter 3 months earlier. The stride length was consistent with a woman of Miriam's height and build. The prints showed no sign of hesitation, no indication that she had stopped or turned or changed direction. She had been walking forward toward the water, and then she had not been walking at all. The dog, Piper, was eventually coaxed from her position at the edge of the path by a volunteer who recognized her from the neighborhood. She was taken to a local veterinarian, examined, and found to be physically unharmed, but her behavior had changed. She wasn't the same dog. The veterinarian, Dr. Ann Kowalski, later wrote in a statement, "Border Collies are active, alert, responsive. Piper was none of those things. She was withdrawn. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing. She wouldn't play. She wouldn't engage. It was like she was waiting for something or someone who was never going to come back." Piper was adopted by Miriam's sister, who lived in Connecticut. She died in 2012, at the age of 10, having never fully recovered her former personality. The National Weather Service was contacted about the fog's unusual behavior. A meteorologist named David Thorne reviewed the available data, satellite imagery, temperature readings, wind patterns, and found nothing that could explain what the witnesses had described. "Fog doesn't reverse," David said in an interview conducted for a local news segment. "It can't. The physics don't work. You'd need a complete reversal of wind direction, temperature gradient, and moisture flow simultaneously, instantaneously, and repeatedly. It's not possible." When asked what he thought the witnesses had seen, David was silent for a moment. "I believe they saw what they said they saw," he said finally. "I just can't explain it. And that's not something I say often." The case attracted brief attention from researchers interested in anomalous atmospheric phenomena. A graduate student from MIT requested access to the weather data and witness statements. Her analysis, submitted as part of a thesis on rare meteorological events, concluded that the fog's behavior was inconsistent with any known atmospheric mechanism and recommended further study. No further study was conducted. The thesis was filed. The case was forgotten. Miriam Delano was declared legally dead in 2015, 7 years after her disappearance. Her sister held a small memorial service in Connecticut. A handful of colleagues from the university attended. The book Miriam had been writing, a critical analysis of absence and loss in 20th century American fiction, was found incomplete on her laptop and has never been published. Her cottage at Owl's Head was cleared of her belongings and rented to another tenant. The new occupant, a young man from Boston who came to Maine to work remotely, reported nothing unusual during his stay. But the locals remember. They remember the fog that moved backward. They remember the woman who walked into it and did not walk out. They remember the footprints that stopped mid-stride, as if Miriam had been lifted from the earth by something invisible and silent and patient. And they remember Piper, sitting at the edge of the path, staring at the place where her owner had vanished, refusing to move, as if she understood something that no human witness could grasp. Gerald Emery, who watched the fog from his kitchen window, died in 2019 at the age of 84. In the years before his death, he rarely spoke of what he had seen, but he once confided in his daughter, who recorded his words in a journal she kept. "I've seen a lot of strange things on the water," Gerald said. "Storms that came from nowhere, lights that had no source, sounds that didn't belong to anything living. But I never saw anything like that fog. It moved like it was thinking, like it was looking for something." His daughter asked what he thought it had been looking for. Gerald was quiet for a long time. "I think it found what it was looking for," he said. "I think it found her. And I think it took her somewhere we can't follow." He paused. "I don't know where, I don't know why. But I watched that fog come and go 3 times, and I watched that woman walk into it, and I watched it take her away. And the thing I can't stop thinking about, the thing that keeps me up at night, is that she didn't scream. She didn't run. She just walked into it, like she knew where she was going." He looked out the window, toward the water, toward the place where the fog had been. Maybe she did. Owl's Head remains a quiet town. The lighthouse still stands on its bluff, its beam still sweeping the darkness. The coastal path still winds along the shore, and people still walk their dogs there in the early morning, watching the fog roll in and out with the patience of the tide. But some mornings, when the fog sits offshore in that particular way, dense, motionless, waiting, the locals do not walk to the water's edge. They remember Miriam Delano. They remember the footprints that stopped. They remember the fog that moved backward 3 times, as if rehearsing something. And they wonder sometimes if it is still rehearsing, if it is still waiting, if one day it will come again, and this time it will not reverse. The disappearance of Miriam Delano remains officially classified as missing person, presumed deceased. The Knox County Sheriff's file was closed in 2015. The atmospheric anomaly observed on February 14, 2008, has never been explained. No similar events have been reported at Owl's Head or elsewhere on the Maine coast. The footprints in the snow were photographed by first responders and remain in the case file. They have never been satisfactorily accounted for. Owl's Head Light continues to operate as an automated navigational aid. The point is open to visitors year-round. The fog still comes. So far, it has not come back the way it did that morning. So far. Memory is unreliable. Tape is not. That is what the documentary crew believed when they arrived in Winter Harbor in the autumn of 1999. They were wrong. Winter Harbor is a small fishing village on the Schoodic Peninsula, the only part of Acadia National Park that sits on the mainland rather than Mount Desert Island. The town faces Frenchman Bay, its harbor sheltered by a series of granite islands that break the worst of the Atlantic swells. In summer, tourists pass through on their way to the park. In winter, the town empties, its population dropping to fewer than 500 souls who endure the isolation with the quiet stubbornness that defines coastal Maine. The village has always been a working community, lobstermen, boat builders, the occasional artist drawn by the harsh beauty of the landscape. The people here do not seek attention. They do not invite curiosity. They answer questions when asked, but they do not volunteer information, and they do not speak of certain things to outsiders. Gerald Pettis was one of those things. Gerald Pettis was 41 years old when he disappeared on the morning of September 3, 1967. He was a third-generation fisherman born in Winter Harbor, educated in its one-room schoolhouse, and married at 22 to a local woman named Constance, who bore him 2 daughters before dying of pneumonia in 1963. After Constance's death, Gerald became increasingly solitary. He continued to fish, continued to maintain his boat, continued to attend church on Sundays, and nod to his neighbors on the street. But something had gone out of him, the townspeople said, some essential spark. He moved through his days like a man waiting for something, though no one could say what. On the morning of September 3rd, Gerald departed Winter Harbor at approximately 5 a.m., heading for his traps in the waters south of Schoodic Island. The weather was clear when he left. By 8 a.m., a fog bank had formed over the outer islands, dense and low, moving slowly toward shore. Gerald's boat, the Constance Marie, was found drifting in the fog at approximately 2 p.m. by another fisherman who had gone looking when Gerald failed to return. The boat was intact, the engine idling, the traps still stacked on the deck. Gerald was not aboard. The search lasted 6 days. Divers explored the waters around Schoodic Island. Aircraft covered the coastline from Winter Harbor to Prospect Harbor. Volunteers walked the shores and the woods, calling Gerald's name until their voices gave out. He was never found. The official finding was presumed drowning, though no body was ever recovered and no explanation was ever offered for why a man would abandon a functional boat in calm conditions. Gerald Pettis was declared legally dead in 1974. His daughters, by then grown, sold his house and his boat and moved away. One went to Portland, the other went to Boston. Neither ever returned to Winter Harbor. The town moved on. The years passed. Gerald Pettis became a name on a memorial plaque, a story old-timers told when the conversation turned to the sea and its mysteries. And then, in 1982, someone saw him again. The documentary crew arrived in Winter Harbor on October 12, 1999. There were 4 of them: a director named Samuel Frost, age 38, a cameraman named Dennis Maynard, age 42, a sound technician named Rebecca Holloway, age 29, and a production assistant named Kevin Briggs, age 24. They were producing an independent documentary about unexplained disappearances along the Maine coast, a project Samuel had been developing for 3 years. He had compiled a list of cases dating back to the early 1900s, fishermen who vanished without a trace, boats found drifting with no crew, bodies that were never recovered despite extensive searches. Gerald Pettis was one of 17 cases he planned to feature. The crew spent their first day in Winter Harbor conducting preliminary interviews with local historians and longtime residents. Most were cooperative but guarded, offering facts without elaboration, dates without context. The disappearance of Gerald Pettis was acknowledged but not discussed in detail. On their second day, October 13th, they interviewed an elderly woman named Hazel Crowley. Hazel was 86 years old, a lifelong resident of Winter Harbor who had known Gerald Pettis since childhood. She had been a year behind him in school, had attended his wedding to Constance, had brought casseroles to his house after Constance died. She was, by her own account, one of the last people to speak with Gerald before he disappeared. The interview was conducted in Hazel's living room, a small, cluttered space filled with photographs of children and grandchildren and the accumulated artifacts of a long life. Dennis set up the camera on a tripod facing Hazel's armchair. Rebecca clipped a wireless microphone to Hazel's cardigan. Samuel sat across from her, just out of frame, holding a list of questions. The tape began recording at approximately 2:15 p.m. For the first 20 minutes, the interview proceeded normally. Hazel described Gerald's childhood, his marriage, his grief after Constance's death. She spoke of the morning he disappeared, how she had seen him walking to the harbor before dawn, how he had waved to her from the dock, how she had never seen him again. Then Samuel asked if there was anything else she wanted to share, anything that hadn't been included in the official record. Hazel was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the camera, then at Samuel, then back at the camera. "He came back," she said. Samuel leaned forward. "What do you mean he came back?" Hazel folded her hands in her lap. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she were describing something she had seen 100 times. "It was 1982, October, I think. Late October. There was fog that morning, thick fog, the kind that sits on the water and doesn't move. I was walking to the post office, same as I did every morning, and I saw him." "Saw who?" "Gerald, standing at the edge of the road near the harbor, just standing there looking out at the water." Samuel glanced at Dennis, who gave a small nod to indicate the camera was still rolling. "Are you sure it was him? I knew Gerald Pettis for 40 years. I knew his face, his walk, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets. It was him." "But he'd been dead for 15 years. Hazel smiled faintly. "That's what I thought, too. I stood there staring at him, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But I wasn't. He was there. And he looked exactly the same. Exactly. Not a day older than the morning he disappeared." "What did you do?" "I walked toward him. I called his name. He turned and looked at me, and he smiled. That same sad smile he always had after Constance died. But he didn't speak. He just looked at me for a moment, and then he turned and walked into the woods." "Into the woods?" "There's a path there near the harbor, leads up into the hills. He walked up that path into the fog, and I never saw him again." Samuel was silent for a moment, processing. "Did you tell anyone?" Hazel nodded. "I told my sister. I told the minister. They said I must have been mistaken, that it was someone who looked like Gerald, or that my eyes were playing tricks. But I know what I saw. I know who I saw." She paused, and I wasn't the only one. According to Hazel, at least 3 other Winter Harbor residents reported seeing Gerald Pettis in the years after his disappearance. A lobsterman named Arthur Beale claimed to have seen him standing on the town wharf in 1978. A woman named Dorothy Woodman reported seeing him walking along the coastal road in 1985. A teenage boy, the son of a summer resident, told his parents he had seen a man in old-fashioned clothes standing at the edge of the fog near Shudik Point in 1991. None of these sightings were officially documented. None were investigated. The witnesses either kept their experiences private or were dismissed as mistaken, confused, or seeking attention. "People don't talk about it," Hazel said. "Not to outsiders, not even to each other, most of the time. But we know. Those of us who've been here long enough, we know Gerald didn't just drown. He went somewhere. And sometimes he comes back." Samuel asked where she thought Gerald had gone. Hazel looked at the camera for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable. "Into the fog," she said. "That's where he went, and that's where he still is. The fog took him, and the fog keeps him, and sometimes, when the fog is thick enough, when the conditions are right, the fog lets him out for a little while." She paused. "But he can't stay. He never stays. He just looks at us, and he smiles, and then he goes back." "Back where?" Hazel shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. I don't think we're supposed to know." The interview continued for another 12 minutes. Hazel spoke of other things: the history of Winter Harbor, her memories of the old fishing fleet, the changes she had witnessed over 8 decades. But she did not speak of Gerald Pettis again. At approximately 2:57 p.m., Samuel thanked her for her time. Dennis stopped the camera. Rebecca removed the microphone. The crew packed their equipment and returned to their motel in Bar Harbor. That evening, they reviewed the footage. The tape was blank, not damaged, not corrupted, blank. Dennis rewound it to the beginning and played it again. The first few seconds showed color bars and a timestamp, standard calibration footage recorded before the interview began. Then the screen went dark. For 38 minutes and 43 seconds, there was nothing. No image, no sound, just blackness, as if the camera had been recording with the lens cap on, except Dennis was certain the lens cap had been off, and the viewfinder had shown a clear image throughout the interview. Then, at the 38-minute and 44-second mark, a single frame appeared. It lasted exactly 1/30th of a second, a single frame of video, barely visible to the naked eye. Dennis had to pause the tape and advance it frame by frame to see it clearly. The image showed fog, dense gray-white fog, filling the frame from edge to edge. And standing in the center of the fog, facing the camera, was a figure, a man. The figure was dark, silhouetted against the lighter fog behind him. His features were indistinct, but his posture was clear, hands at his sides, shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted as if looking at something just below the camera's eye. He appeared to be smiling. The crew spent the rest of the evening trying to explain the footage. Dennis checked the camera for malfunctions. Rebecca tested the audio equipment. Kevin examined the tape itself, looking for signs of damage or degradation. They found nothing wrong. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The tape was undamaged. There was no technical explanation for why 40 minutes of recorded interview had been replaced by blackness and a single, inexplicable frame. Samuel called Hazel the next morning to arrange a follow-up interview. There was no answer. He drove to her house and found it empty. A neighbor informed him that Hazel had been taken to the hospital in Ellsworth during the night. She had suffered a stroke. Hazel Crawley died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. She was buried in the Winter Harbor Cemetery, not far from a stone that bore the name of Gerald Pettis, a memorial marker since there was no body beneath it. The documentary was never completed. Samuel Frost abandoned the project in early 2000, citing personal reasons. Dennis Maynard kept the tape for several years before donating it, along with other materials from his career, to a film archive at Boston University. The archive cataloged the tape as Winter Harbor Interview, October 1999, footage damaged/unusable. It remains there in a climate-controlled vault, available for viewing by researchers who request access. Few do. In 2014, a graduate student in documentary studies named Christine Almeida requested access to the tape as part of her thesis on abandoned film projects. She was granted permission and viewed the footage in a private screening room. Her notes, included in her thesis, describe the experience. The tape is exactly as described in the production notes, approximately 40 minutes of black screen, followed by a single frame of imagery. I was able to isolate the frame and examine it in detail. The figure in the fog is clearly a man, though his features are impossible to discern. He appears to be standing approximately 15 to 20 feet from the camera. His posture suggests someone who is aware of being observed. What I cannot explain is the timestamp. The frame is marked with a date and time code, standard for video equipment of that era. The date reads September 3, 1967. The time reads 5:47 a.m. According to the production notes, this tape was recorded on October 13, 1999. The camera used was manufactured in 1996. There is no way the timestamp could display a date 32 years before the camera existed. I do not have an explanation for this discrepancy. Christine included a still image of the frame in her thesis. It has been reproduced in several articles about anomalous recordings and unexplained phenomena. In each reproduction, the figure in the fog is visible, dark, indistinct, facing the camera. Some who have viewed the image claim the figure is waving. Others say he is simply standing still. Others say he is not there at all, that the image is a trick of compression, a glitch in the transfer, a phantom created by aging magnetic tape. But the timestamp remains. September 3, 1967. The morning Gerald Pettus disappeared. Winter Harbor is quiet now, as it has always been. The fishing boats still go out at dawn. The fog still rolls in from Frenchman Bay. The tourists still pass through on their way to Schoodic Point, taking photographs of the granite shores and the dark evergreen forests. The people who remember Gerald Pettus are mostly gone. Hazel Crowley is buried in the cemetery on the hill. Arthur Beale died in 2003. Dorothy Woodman moved to a nursing home in Bangor and died in 2009. But the story persists, passed down in fragments, mentioned in whispers, when the fog is thick and the harbor is quiet. They say Gerald Pettus is still out there, somewhere in the fog. They say he comes back sometimes when the conditions are right. They say he stands at the edge of the road or the shore or the woods, looking at the town he left behind, smiling that sad smile he always wore after his wife died. They say he does not speak. He does not stay. He only watches. And then he goes back into the fog, back to wherever the fog keeps him. The disappearance of Gerald Pettus remains officially classified as presumed drowning. Body not recovered. The case file was closed in 1974. The documentary footage recorded on October 13, 1999, remains in the Boston University Film Archive. The single frame of imagery has never been explained. The timestamp discrepancy has not been resolved. No further sightings of Gerald Pettus have been reported since 1991. But the fog still comes to Winter Harbor. And sometimes, when it is thick enough, when the light is just right, the old-timers say you can see a figure standing at its edge, watching, smiling, waiting for something that may never come, or that already has. Some boats are born from wood and nails and the patient labor of human hands. Others come from somewhere else entirely. Korea is a fishing village at the end of the world, or so it feels to those who live there. The town sits at the tip of a narrow peninsula that juts into the Gulf of Maine, connected to the mainland by a single road that winds through miles of blueberry barrens and spruce forest, before finally reaching the cluster of weathered houses and wharves that constitute the village center. The population hovers around 300, swelling slightly in summer when the occasional tourist discovers the place, and shrinking in winter when the cold drives even the hardiest residents indoors. There is a general store, a lobster co-op, a small church, and a cemetery where the headstones date back to the 1700s. There are no hotels, no restaurants, no amenities for visitors. Korea does not want to be found, and most of the time it isn't. The people here are lobstermen, nearly all of them, their families rooted in these waters for generations. They know every rock, every current, every shift in the weather that signals trouble or opportunity. They know the fog, the thick, patient fog that rolls in from the Gulf and settles over the harbor for hours, sometimes days, transforming the familiar into something strange and unmappable. They thought they knew everything the fog could do. They were wrong. The fog arrived on the morning of August 7, 2017. It came from the southeast, as fog usually does along this stretch of coast, a gray-white wall that swallowed the outer islands before creeping into Korea Harbor with the slow inevitability of the tide. This was not unusual. Fog is a constant companion in coastal Maine, particularly in late summer when the warm air meets the cold water and the atmosphere cannot decide what it wants to be. The lobstermen of Korea are accustomed to waiting. They know the fog will lift when it is ready and not before. But this fog did not lift. By the second day, the harbor was invisible from shore. By the third, residents could not see their neighbors' houses. By the fifth, the fog had become so dense that walking to the general store felt like navigating a dreamscape, each step taking the walker further from anything solid or certain. The National Weather Service issued advisories but could not explain the fog's persistence. There was no weather system holding it in place, no temperature inversion that would account for its duration. The fog simply was, as if it had decided to stay, and no force of nature or science could persuade it otherwise. On the sixth day, someone noticed the boats. The first to see them was a lobsterman named Curtis Crowley, age 63, who had walked to the town wharf at dawn to check on his boat. The fog was so thick he could barely see the water, but as he stood at the end of the pier, a faint breeze stirred the air, and for a moment, just a moment, the fog parted. 3 boats sat at anchor in the middle of the harbor. Curtis did not recognize them. This was significant. Korea Harbor is small, and Curtis had worked these waters for more than 40 years. He knew every boat in the harbor by sight, their colors, their lines, the particular way each one sat in the water. These 3 boats were strangers. They were wooden-hulled, which was unusual in an era of fiberglass and aluminum. Their designs were old-fashioned, reminiscent of the working boats built in the early 20th century. High bows, low sterns, open decks, the practical silhouettes of vessels meant for hard labor in hard waters. But there was something wrong with them. Curtis squinted through the fog, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The boats had no names painted on their sterns. They had no registration numbers on their bows. They had no markings of any kind, no port of origin, no owner identification, nothing to indicate where they had come from or to whom they belonged. And their wood was wrong. Even from a distance, Curtis could see that the planking was too smooth, too uniform, as if the boats had never been used, or as if they had been built by someone who had never actually seen how wooden boats age and weather and accumulate the scars of a working life. The fog closed again, and the boats vanished. Curtis stood on the wharf for another hour, waiting for the fog to part again. It did not. By the time he returned home, he had almost convinced himself he had imagined the whole thing. Then his neighbor told him she had seen them too. Over the next 3 days, more than a dozen Korea residents reported sighting the 3 boats. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The boats appeared when the fog thinned momentarily, always in the same positions, always at anchor, always empty. No one saw anyone aboard. No one saw the boats move or adjust, or do anything that suggested human presence. Attempts to reach the boats were unsuccessful. 2 lobstermen tried to motor out to them on the 7th day, but the fog was so thick they could not navigate safely, and they turned back after nearly colliding with the breakwater. Another fisherman tried to row out on the 8th day, but he reported that no matter how long he rowed, the boats never seemed to get any closer, as if they were receding at exactly the speed of his approach. "It was like chasing something in a dream," he said later. "You can see it, but you can't reach it. You can't touch it. It's there, but it isn't." The harbor master, a woman named Elaine Woodward, contacted the Coast Guard to report the unidentified vessels. The Coast Guard acknowledged the report, but could not dispatch a patrol boat due to the fog conditions. They advised Elaine to document the boats if possible and report any changes. Elaine walked to the wharf every morning and every evening, hoping to photograph the vessels. She caught glimpses of them twice, but was never able to capture a clear image. The fog always closed before she could focus her camera. On the night of August 14th, the 8th night of the fog, someone else saw the boats. Someone saw more than the boats. Her name was Margaret Beale. She was 54 years old, married for 31 years to a fisherman named Daniel Beale, mother of 2 grown sons who had left Korea for jobs in Portland and Boston. She and Daniel lived in a small house overlooking the harbor, the same house his grandparents had built in 1923. Margaret woke at approximately 2 a.m., as she often did when sleep eluded her. She walked to the kitchen for a glass of water and glanced out the window that faced the harbor. The fog was thinner than it had been in days. She could see the water, the silhouettes of the boats at the moorings, the faint outline of the breakwater beyond. And she could see the 3 strange boats. They were there, anchored in the center of the harbor, just as the others had described. Their dark hulls were visible against the gray water, their masts rising into the fog like fingers pointing at nothing. On the deck of the middle boat a figure was standing. Margaret pressed her face to the glass, trying to see more clearly. The figure was a man, she was certain of that. He was standing at the rail, facing the shore, facing her house, facing her. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the August night. She knew that silhouette. She knew that posture, the slightly rounded shoulders, the way he stood with his weight on his left leg, the particular tilt of his head. It was Daniel. Her husband was on the boat. Her husband, who had been asleep in their bed when she got up, was standing on the deck of a boat that should not exist, looking at their house. Margaret ran to the bedroom. The bed was empty. She ran outside, still in her nightgown, and down to the harbor. By the time she reached the wharf, the fog had closed again. The boats were invisible. The harbor was silent. She called Daniel's name. There was no answer. She stood on the wharf until dawn, waiting, calling, praying. The fog did not part. Her husband did not appear. On the morning of August 15th, the 9th day, the fog lifted. It did not lift gradually, as fog typically does. It lifted all at once, as if someone had raised a curtain. One moment the harbor was shrouded in white. The next it was clear, the water sparkling in the morning sun, the boats at their moorings, the islands visible in the distance. The 3 strange boats were gone. So was Daniel Beale. A search was launched immediately. Coast Guard vessels and local lobster boats covered the waters around Korea, searching for any sign of Daniel or the phantom vessels. Aircraft flew patterns over the Gulf. Divers explored the harbor floor. Nothing was found. Daniel's own boat, the Mary Christine, was at her mooring where she had been throughout the fog. His truck was in the driveway. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His reading glasses were on the nightstand beside the bed he had shared with Margaret for 3 decades. He had not taken anything. He had not left a note. He had simply vanished, as if he had stepped out of his life and into another one entirely. The investigation was brief and inconclusive. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication that Daniel had intended to leave, no sign that he had been in distress or danger. The 3 boats that residents had reported were never identified, never located, never explained. The official finding was missing, circumstances undetermined. Daniel Beale was declared legally dead in 2024, 7 years after his disappearance. Margaret refused to accept the finding. She remains in the house overlooking the harbor, sleeping alone in the bed they shared, keeping Daniel's reading glasses on the nightstand where he left them. She gave one interview to a reporter from the Ellsworth American in 2018. Her account of what she saw that night has never changed. "I saw him on that boat," she said. "I saw my husband standing there, looking at our house. And the thing I keep thinking about, the thing I can't get out of my head, is the way he looked. He didn't look scared. He didn't look confused. He looked peaceful, like he'd finally found something he'd been looking for." The reporter asked what she thought Daniel had been looking for. Margaret was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I think those boats knew. I think they came for him. I think they'd been coming for him for a long time, and the fog was just how they got here." She paused, her eyes distant. "He looked like he'd been waiting a long time. That's what I can't stop seeing. He looked like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for something, and it had finally arrived. No one in Korea has ever been able to explain where the three boats came from or where they went. Naval architects who were shown sketches based on witness descriptions could not match the designs to any known blueprint or boat-building tradition. Maritime historians found no record of vessels matching the descriptions in any registry, any archive, any historical account. The boats, as far as anyone can determine, were never built. They simply appeared, and then they disappeared, taking Daniel Beale with them. Korea remains a fishing village at the end of the world. The lobstermen still go out at dawn. The fog still rolls in from the Gulf, thick and patient, settling over the harbor for hours or days before lifting again. Life continues, as it always has, shaped by the rhythms of the tide and the seasons and the slow accumulation of years. But the people who were here in August of 2017 do not forget. They remember the 9 days of fog. They remember the boats that appeared from nowhere and vanished the same way. They remember Daniel Beale, who was one of them, who had worked these waters his entire life, who disappeared on a night when the fog lifted for no one but him. And they remember what his wife said, that he looked like a man who had been waiting a long time. Some of the older fishermen, when they speak of it at all, say that the sea takes people in its own time and its own way. They say that Daniel was called, and when you are called, you go. They do not say who does the calling or where the called are taken. Some questions, they have learned, are not meant to be answered. Margaret Beale still walks to the harbor every morning, just as she did when Daniel was alive. She stands at the end of the wharf and looks out at the water, at the boats, at the place where the three vessels appeared and disappeared. She is waiting. She does not know what she is waiting for exactly. Perhaps another fog, perhaps another sighting, perhaps her husband returning the same way he left, stepping out of the impossible and back into the life they shared. She knows it is unlikely. She knows it may never happen. But she waits anyway. Because she saw him that night. She saw him standing on a boat that should not exist, looking back at their house, looking back at her. And she cannot shake the feeling that he saw her too, that he wanted to say something, that he was trying to tell her where he was going, or asking her to follow. The disappearance of Daniel Beale remains officially classified as missing, presumed deceased. The case file was closed in 2024. The three unidentified vessels observed in Korea Harbor during the fog of August 2017 have never been explained. No matching boats have been found in any registry or historical record. The fog that settled over Korea for 9 consecutive days remains the longest recorded fog event in the village's history. No meteorological explanation has been provided. Margaret Beale continues to reside in Korea, Maine. She continues to wait. The fog continues to come. And somewhere, perhaps, the boats that were never built continue to sail, carrying passengers to a destination that no map has ever shown, no compass has ever found, and no one who remains behind will ever understand. Until the fog comes for them too,